Archie.
Sara Polak, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me.
No, thank you for taking the time to come and have a chat with us, because when I saw your bio, I was instantly fascinated. Civilizational resilience researcher. Can you tell us a little bit about what civilizational research is?
Yeah, I mean, God, if I only knew, that'd be great. You know, it's one of those things where the bio looks really flashy, but then the reality is that you're reading through a lot of like boring archaeological papers and stuff like that. But basically, like I told you before we started like filming this, that if I was to like describe my career, I'd say, oh, you know, I'm a very kind of Renaissance person, and the reality is I've probably got undiagnosed ADHD, so I'm fascinated by everything. But predominantly, I studied archaeology, anthropology, both kind of social, cultural and cognitive evolutionary, and then I was basically, for various reasons, spent my entire career in tech. And what I've kind of seen happening over and over again is that regardless what the tech product was, which usually didn't work anyway, but you know, the PR was always good. The bulk of my job was basically like dispelling almost like Palaeolithic kind of feelings and emotions amongst the people, like fear of innovation, just like not understanding how to integrate tech, not understanding like how to actually change your job with the tech. And like it was, when it happened like with the fourth company, I thought, okay, there's a pattern here where we really need an interdisciplinary approach to bridge human behavior that I think is fundamentally very Paleolithic in a lot of ways, and the godlike technology that we don't really know how to deal with. And only by bridging those two very disparate disciplines can we actually achieve something which I think is called civilizational resilience, but it can probably have like other names, which is fundamentally how to be future-proof. So like my favorite example of civilizational resilience from fiction is Jules Verne, who wrote fantastic novels in the kind of Belle Epoque at the end of the 19th century, and his character of Captain Nemo, who was very kind of independent, like basically completely abandoned like the world and went into the sea, so like created a whole new domain for him, was very autonomous, very innovative, very kind of self-sufficient, and that for me is someone who is future-ready because they're immune to the, let's say, frivolities of like the day-to-day, you know, politics and social changes, etc. So that's a theme that really interests me, to create these Captain Nemos out of people, to make them autonomous and stand on their own 2 feet and not be manipulated by either politics or other institutions that I am not a big fan of. So I'm trying to research it. We're basically at the stage of, you know, researcher maybe sounds a bit like glorious. We basically have this think tank, and it's a bunch of us who we're creating a board game, and we write blogs and all that jazz. And in parallel, I teach and have a research group that is meant to be bridging these, like, kind of the humanities and engineering and technology. And also we're kind of like trying to have a couple of startups on the side. I mean, we bought the domains and have a website, so, you know, we've got a functional startup.
Looking for a secure, trusted way to buy, sell and hold Bitcoin? Gemini has been leading the way since 2014. Founded by the Winklevoss twins to be a security-first, fully regulated Bitcoin platform. With Gemini, your Bitcoin is protected with enterprise-grade security, backed by insurance and Type 2 certifications for SOC 1 and SOC 2. Whether you're new to Bitcoin or a long-time hodler, Gemini gives you the tools to stack sats and build generational wealth your way. From simple one-tap buys to advanced charts and trading features, it's all here. Buy, sell and hold securely. That's Gemini. Gemini. Bitcoin with confidence. Need cash without selling your Bitcoin? With DeBiFi, you borrow against your Bitcoin, non-custodial, multi-sig escrow, and you keep your keys. No banks, no selling, just institutional grade liquidity with terms up to 2 years and APRs as low as 9%. All transactions are signed using private keys on your own device. Using a 3 of 4 multi-sig setup, 3 out of 4 keys must approve every transaction, giving you control, transparency, and peace of mind. Whether you're a hodler, miner, small business, or treasury team, DeBiFi gives you the cash you need now without giving up your Bitcoin upside or triggering a taxable event. Get liquidity, keep exposure, and stay secure. That's DeBiFi. DeBiFi, your Bitcoin, your money.
You mentioned tech resistance, which is a really important thing that, in the context of Bitcoin, you know, we have this thing called FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And whenever the media, up until very recently, it was almost 100% negative coverage.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And we just call that FUD. And a lot of that is to do, sometimes it features tech resistance, so they play to the angle of tech resistance and the fear that some people have about introducing new technology. With Bitcoin, it's energy consumption, bad for the environment, boiling the oceans, all that sort of thing. And we, an environmentalist, Bitcoiner, Daniel Batten, he said this is something that happens with every new technology, with electricity, with automobiles and everything. Have you looked in and studied much about those particular examples? And are there any others that you can perhaps analogize for Bitcoin? Because we're going through that right now. It's only when you put it in the broader context, we're like, oh, so it's not unique to us. They don't just hate us. This is just what happens when there's something new.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually think that when I mentioned the Paleolithic emotions and the godlike technology, that comes from a quote by E.O. Wilson, who's passed away now. He also studied ants, by the way, which is quite funny that he studied humans and ants. I think we're very similar in a lot of ways. It's like the British and the ants, you know, like a weird loyalty to the queen, love queuing, take things that aren't theirs back into the ant house. But I missed out a crucial thing, which is that he basically said that the problem with humanities, we've got Paleolithic emotions, godlike technology, and medieval institutions, and that is, I think, the main bit of the resistance that comes with whether that's Bitcoin or whether that's alternating current with Tesla or whether that's the Luddites kind of breaking down during the Industrial Revolution, textile machinery and like manufacturing machinery. It's the same thing. It's because the institutions, they are the third party in the peer-to-peer. So like I think humans and tech would get along just fine, and humans are very quick to adopt new technology when they realize it's evolutionary beneficial to them. The problem is that a lot of these processes, whether that's control of information or whether that's dissemination of value, that goes through a third party, which is an institution, which is this nameless, weird kind of gray cloud. In anthropology, there's this fascinating theme which is called institutional aggression, where basically you can't pinpoint, for example, the fact that almost 250,000 people in the UK a year die because of the long time that it takes for people to be seen by the NHS. So it's just a product of bad process. And you can't blame a single person for that, but it's just the complexity of the institution that inevitably comes with scaling a civilization beyond the Dunbar number, which is roughly 150 people, so that's pretty much any civilization that we currently live in. And because the institutions will not willingly destroy themselves, because that would be anti-evolutionary for them, they want to survive, they basically reject anything that kind of endangers their prime position, their pole position in society. So obviously a bank isn't going to want Bitcoin to come into the market, right? A state isn't going to want Bitcoin to come into the market. And then even though they're completely illogical arguments, so one of the ones I find funny, I mean, I don't understand Bitcoin all that well, but one of the ones I find funny is that, Bitcoin is used on the dark market to trade drugs and weapons. And what do you think Escobar was using in the 80s? I mean, the dollars are used for exactly the same thing, so it's just quite funny. But because it comes from top down, people tend to see that narrative as somehow godly and with authority, and so they react to it and reject it because their position in society is basically that of a human abacus, right? In order to scale civilization, you need people to kind of give up their independence, give up their individuality, and to work for the benefit of the machine, of the institution. And when a technology challenges that, obviously the machine isn't going to like it, and the people are inevitably going to, lose their jobs. So while in a long term, for the people, it'd be beneficial for them to adopt this technology, for the short term, which is, paying rent or paying for your kid's school, that endangers the kind of machine ecosystem. So that happens with Bitcoin. It happened. A beautiful example is the current wars in the 1880s between Edison and Tesla, very similar to what we see now, where when Tesla basically went to work for Edison, Edison just wanted to steal his patents, as he did with many young, naive students in the day. Obviously, that doesn't happen with big tech anymore. Exploiting the young people who just want, to be a part of the innovative cycle. And then Edison was very clever. He was a massive virtue signaler. He would pay for the suffragettes. He would go for dinners in the White House. He was very kind of concerned about the well-being of the planet. But at the same time, there are arguments that he plotted to have Tesla killed by like burning down the place where he slept, like including his nodes. He went on this massive rampage where because he was obviously didn't want to be like pasted in a like bad way over the media, he paid this guy, Harold, who was a crusader against alternating current, who would take like cats, dogs out of pounds, horses from farms, I think even elephants from circuses, and he would fry them with alternating current on the street, take money from people that would watch these animals fry. He'd be like, oh, isn't that dangerous? At the same time, I think this was 1888, Edison was on the neutral academic committee of the first electric chair. Capital punishment and institutions, that's maybe another topic, this kind of monopolization of power and death, which is always very scary to me. But anyway, Edison, this dentist came up with the idea of the electric chair, because dentists are sadists, so as you do, I'm sorry, anyone who's a dentist watching this. And Edison said, yeah, like this is great, but we can't use my direct current for this. We need to use Tesla's and Westinghouse's alternating one. And he had this like espionage where he would steal the generator from Westinghouse's factory. He would plug it into the electric chair. Westinghouse was even trying to pay for this poor bastard's kind of legal fees to get him away. They didn't. He fried for like 20 minutes, like in complete agony. Like he ended up this crisp like barbecue. It was awful. So then, like when this wasn't working, Edison ramped it up. So he'd have these like PR printed things in the newspapers of like these electrical wires and like the skull and crossbones on them, and everyone dying underneath. And it actually culminated in the electrical wire panic until, and I'm kind of coming back 360 to the role of the institution, in the 1893 World Columbia Exposition, Tesla got a state job or a state contract to electrify this expo, and he got another contract with putting a generator under the Niagara Falls. So the moment that the state said, oh, okay, AC's fine because we need to connect the East Coast and the West Coast, and direct current can't do that. So yeah, why don't we invest into AC? Suddenly this all went away. So I'm just waiting, for this to happen with like AI and like Bitcoin and all these like big technologies that are currently in the midst of a very institutional, political, geopolitical money war and power play. And like for it to skip that and actually get to the people, because like right now the institutions are what's causing the havoc, I think.
That's fascinating that you said as soon as the government backed alternating current, all that FUD just disappeared from amongst all the institutions. And yet when we confront particular journalists, so especially like from the Financial Times on Twitter, they will say, no one tells us what to write. They're actually oblivious to their own incentives to continue this fudding of Bitcoin and anything that's sort of outside the system. They're completely oblivious to that. And yet, time and time again, we see this signaling from power centers influencing all sorts of organizations in this sort of disparate blob of institutionalism, shall we say. And how do you think that they maintain a facade of self-direction?
Yeah, that's a very good. It's a
self-delusion of independence, but yet time and time again we see them complying with the signaling from power centers.
Oh, completely. Like the problem is like this is, for example, why for me and honestly, like I don't understand, say, crypto mathematically, right? I'm from the humanities, so I love it. I try my best to understand conceptually, but the maths eludes me somewhat. But this is what I find fascinating on the whole, and I know that. For Bitcoin people to hear like Web3 mentioned in the same sentence as Bitcoin,
like we can deal with it.
It's difficult, but I'm just trying to say, like from an outsider's perspective, like the revolution of like decentralized distributed systems is phenomenal for basically the peer-to-peer information economy, because basically traditionally, like the moment that you had writing invented, like say 3,500 BC, something like that, you had an elite controlling the recording system, right? Whether that was a like elite in terms of wealth or elite in the sense that you were a gatekeeper because you knew how to read and write, it was a very small proportion of people. Like the moment you suddenly then had the printing press, for example, it led to massive social upheavals like the Renaissance or the Reformation, because suddenly I think it was like 200 million books were printed in a very short space of time, because they're traditionally maintained and written by monks, who had nothing better to do than books and brewing beer, which was both great, but again, very small group of people. And suddenly people could like, because they could take the information home with them and digest them on their own time, like on their own means, they started asking questions logically. And with asking questions came challenges to the status quo, like the Catholic Church. And afterwards, when you had, like the dissemination of information, for example, by telegraph, radio, etc., it was instantaneous, which was another revolution in information dissemination, but again, very centrally controlled. Like, so Goebbels, taking the radio, which is a very cheap bit of propaganda, and getting it basically kind of cloning himself into every single living room. And now we're in a situation where, in a lot of ways, we don't actually need the institutions, who until now were the curators of information and curators of opinion. And we can actually exchange the information amongst ourselves, verify everything, fact check everything. Plus, with the large language models, for the first time ever, we don't even have the gatekeepers in terms of the zeros and ones like programmers or IT people that help us communicate with cyberspace, because we can communicate with cyberspace using normal human language. So even us from the humanities, we can suddenly talk to this huge amassed database that we wouldn't have been able to talk to 3 years ago into such detail. So I think that there's another revolution coming. When it comes to politics, I used to, or like journalism and politics, I think they're very two connected pieces in this kind of institutional dissemination of information. I used to work in a startup called Nation Builder in like 2015, 2017. It was the time of Cambridge Analytica as well. And we were non-partisan, so we worked with everyone from extreme left to extreme right. And obviously, as you can tell by my accent, I was quite involved like on the British political side of things. And I don't know if anyone of you have seen, or you've seen The Thick of It, which is one of my favorite series of all time. And you can see like the Malcolm Tucker, who's modeled on Alistair Campbell, like you can see him like being the spin doctor for the given party, having the journalist in the palm of his hand, deciding what gets disseminated to each journalist. And journalism, especially in Britain, is a very kind of elite thing, right? You work for the FT, you work for the Telegraph, and you are probably a certain demographic. You are probably friends with the people who sit in the Houses of Parliament. And it's a very small tribe that basically create an economy out of information. And now, again, like these new technologies, they're kind of bringing that down, because anyone can check it. They don't need to read the FT, right? The traditional media is dying precisely for this reason. So I think that there was a small clique that kind of worked very well in the 19th century, very well even until the 1990s, that is now eroding completely. And they're trying the hardest to cling on to that clique and to that livelihood, which means discrediting anything that's endangering it. So I think that the politics and journalism hasn't really caught up with the fact that, like, technologically, they become redundant. But we don't know, because we have these medieval institutions, how to replace it as a society, because we already live at such a scale. We don't know if we extract these people who mediate information for us or govern us, if we take them out of the equation, what the social structure will look like, which is why I think that, things like archaeology are still so important to study these days, because they help us maybe navigate those narratives.
Were the themes of fear-mongering similar or the same from, going from an oral tradition to a written tradition to then the printing press and then radio and then internet? Can you see some clear themes across all of those, or were there different types of themes in different eras?
That's a very good question. I think trust and holding each other to account is key. So one of the first, archaeologically first aspects of Homo sapiens trying to keep a record of something is the Limbobo and the Ishango bone, which is a bit of baboon tibia. And you've got these, like when you go for a beer, and you do these checks, like you've got these like carvings in the bone that have got kind of very deliberately made. And obviously archaeologists, whenever we don't know, we say, it's probably ritual purposes, right? So like the story behind it is difficult to decipher. Feminist archaeology thinks it was, female Homo sapiens marking a menstrual cycle. Like it's open to interpretation, but nonetheless, you can see that like even before we had the written word, one of the first tendencies of humans with modern brains to do was keep record of something, because our memories just don't serve us well. And also the moment you mark something down, you can show that to everyone. It acts like a witness, that record. So I think that is something that is kind of connecting everything, but obviously like withholding that record and withholding that storage of information and kind of holding on to it, that is something that gives people power, which is why information is power, right? And I think we're getting to the stage where not anymore necessarily, because everyone's got the same information, regardless of your, academic titles or whatever. Everyone's got access to pretty much the same information, and that is creating a huge revolution, I think, because it's unprecedented.
We had an explosion of access to information at different periods prior. How is it different this time?
It's different because this time there's the technological aspect of decentralization. So I'm not trying to be naive. Like, there will definitely still be gatekeeping. That humans will still be humans. They'll try to hack it. They'll try to like dick each other over. That's humans, right? That's who we are. But like, even when you had the printing press, you would have publishing houses that would look after. It wasn't like you had a family with a printing press at home. There was still a certain craft attached to replicating information. It was the same with telegraph radio. Like, yeah, you could have it at home, but it was difficult to produce your own radio and have your own radio station. You had, again, like during the Second World War, you'd have like partisans, using the kind of like handheld radios, and there was a lot of like local hacking in crisis, but at scale you couldn't really do that. And in the internet, especially like Web 2, for the first time you have this explosion of user-generated content. But again, the problem is that the user-generated content is happening on a fundamentally very like oligarchic backbone, where you have a few kind of big tech companies that have our information, that basically are dealing with that information, that are making money out of that information. And I think for the first time ever, we're getting to the stage where the average person can not only create but also store that information, which I think is huge, because we didn't. You could. The previous revolutions, I think, that happened is that you, for example, didn't need to go to the library. You could buy the book, you could have it at home, etc. That was great, but you couldn't really run a library unless you were very, very wealthy. And actually, one of the biggest signs of wealth was having a library, in a stately home. And I think like the first time ever, you can have the library, you can disseminate the information, you can create the information, and you can trade the information, and it can be transparent. And that combo hasn't really happened in the past. So I think that's unique for that reason.
I mean, just thinking back over history, I feel like every new technology leads to an explosion of relative decentralization for that era, and then a coalescing back towards, centralized forces. So with the publishing, the printing press, we saw an explosion of publications. And then you mentioned, I guess, the publishing houses centralized the distribution eventually. It didn't exclude people from doing it, but the economic forces centralize the publication of a book. Like, if you, for the longest time, up until 20 years ago, if you wanted to publish something, you had to get a publishing deal with a publishing house. To go independent was very, very difficult. Possible, but nobody would read what you'd written, right? And then we've, I guess, industrial scale production of newspapers. At one point, we had so many publications of newspapers. The idea that every little faction within society would have their newspaper read by like a few hundred people. That used to happen, but economic forces consolidated that again up until the time of the internet. And then we saw another explosion of decentralized information bursts, but now we're all on the same 5 platforms, or however many it is. So I'm like, why does that happen? Is there something innate within human beings that we want to coalesce around known sources of information? Because there's nothing that compels us to use all of the same platforms. And we'd probably still be exposed to much of the same information if we used independent platforms, but yet we don't.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, this is just my opinion, right? Like, I'm not Nostradamus on this, but I think social capital is a huge part in this, and just human ego. So Pierre Bourdieu in the 70s, a great anthropologist, he wrote this thing that on one hand you have financial capital, which is obvious, basically just like tokens of value, but then you have capital which is often not expressed numerically, but we calculate it very complexly in our minds, which is, for example, based off of reciprocity, right? So you invited me here. I'm really, really grateful. So, next time...
We're grateful for you as well, so yeah.
Thank you. So next time you're in Prague, I'll invite you over for a beer, that kind of thing. And obviously, you're a very sympathetic dude, and I'd like to do that anyways. But I feel, that's really nice that they invited me. And there's a kind of, not debt, but some kind of connection and some kind of like feedback loop that is happening. Or one of you is going to say, "Oh, this is the best interview I've heard in my entire life. I'm going to send you a care package or whatever." But these kind of mechanisms, which we might tend to dismiss as like these like soft skills, or like these like this kind of like fluffy nonsense, is actually creating this like like untallied economy like between humans that is of huge value. So I think the reason why we're on Instagram like isn't that we would think that Instagram's technologically superior, because it's not. It's actually pretty shit given like how wealthy Meta is. It's not because of the quality of the people. It's the numbers, and it's the numbers that make us happy. And again, I remember this from the Nation Builder, the politics days. We were like curating email campaigns for politicians, and I remember when we were doing the French presidential campaign, and Sarkozy, his team were like, oh, you know, we got to make sure we got more people in the database than the other presidential candidate. And I was like, why? Like, I know it's probably a thing of ego, but why do you care? It's like, oh, we've got to have more because that makes us more popular. It's like, well, no, because even if you have more people in your kind of like campaign list, but they don't read your emails because your emails are just long essays that are just like about how great Sarkozy is, then I'd rather have smaller numbers but more engagement. But that's not what Web 2 is built around, because Web 2 is built around traffic and attention equaling value. And I think that what you have Web 2 and what Web 3 I think brings is that actually value equals value. So suddenly you're not chasing the clout, you're not chasing numbers, but you're actually chasing the meaningful interactions, which again, I don't think was really like an important criterion until now, because the KPIs were selling most copies, you know, being most popular, basically waving your dick about and saying how important you are. Whereas what humans are best at, and again, I go back to the Dunbar number, is small coordinated groups that exchange information very efficiently. Because in my opinion, anything that is too big is just doomed to fail. Like, you're just waiting for the falling off the cliff. You know, it's like the British Empire, like, you know, they're doing great for a while and then now comes the inevitable kind of fall. That's going to happen to any, I think, kind of like big influencer, anyone who is just chasing the numbers and not engagement. So yeah, that's another reason why I think that this kind of technological revolution is great, and yeah, we'll see.
You mentioned tokens of value. What's a token of value? Where does that term come from?
Yeah.
What was the first example of a token of value?
Yeah, so I think that we can, like, again, archaeologically, we're sometimes grasping at straws, but I think we can go back to examples like Grotte du Pigeon or like other similar archaeological sites where you find, for example, cowrie shells that were probably exchanges like items of value that you collect them. They're quite aesthetically pleasing, so they kind of tick the box that we're basically just like hairless chimps who really like pretty things. So like it's a nice thing to exchange. Often they would have holes in them, so you could probably like create I don't know, necklaces, whatever, from them. And you could easily count them as well. So you could give 10 cowrie shells for, I don't know, a piece of meat. I don't know. But you have this kind of evidence of exchange pretty much from, I don't know, 50,000 BC, definitely, probably even earlier than that. Like there's a concept of exchange in chimps as well, right? So it has to be some kind of behavioral lowest common denominator that could be millions and millions years old. And so that kind of token of value is some way of expressing in something measurable that what I'm doing for you has that value and that you recognize that and that we can agree on that. So from that perspective, Bitcoin it's an anthropologist's wet dream, because like it's basically doing something that has been encoded in our minds for millions of years, but it's just putting it into practice and it's making it scalable. So that's why I think it's such a fantastic technology, because it's just replicating something that we see in the archaeological record for pretty much in every single civilization. One of the first things that you have is some evidence of trade and tokenizing that trade. And that doesn't have to be money. Money is just kind of one way of scaling value. So yeah.
So we've been abstracting value for 50,000 years.
Oh, probably even more than that.
Even more than that.
Yeah. So like you have these really interesting like reciprocity. So Marcel Mauss in his book Le Don, the gift. This is from maybe 80 years old. This monograph of his. He talks about principles of reciprocity, and basically every single tribe or civilization that you observe has these kind of reciprocal mechanisms going on, and it's basically that what the gift economy is what fundamentally like really is the social lubricant. So there's a fantastic book which is called Unwrapping Christmas by Daniel Miller, and he talks about like how during Christmas we exchange gifts, and like how you spend most money on usually your mum. At some point there's a cutoff. You start spending most money on your partner, because that kind of like jumps up in the social hierarchy. You spend less money on your I don't know, partner's mum, but you spend more from like your aunt, you know, because that's your blood. So that these are really interesting mechanisms that are going on. The fact that we take price tags off gifts, for example, because you don't want to know how much you spent because of the emotion that counts. The fact that we wrap them, you know, like all these like little things, it really shows that like giving and reciprocity and exchange are like absolutely crucial. And there's a really beautiful ethnography that was written by Bronislaw Malinowski, which is it's ancient. It's like 1920s, I think, and he wrote about the Trobriand Islands and the Kula Ring, and it's in the Pacific, and basically you have this archipelago, and in one direction they exchange, I think, God, it's a long time that I did this. I think they exchange necklaces. In the other, they exchange like wristbands or something like that, made again out of shells and things like that. But it's just a ruse. No one gives a damn about the jewelry. But like they will take the canoes, they'll go to the next island, they'll ceremonially hand over this bit of jewelry. But in parallels, they do like business deals, political deals, alliances, exchange partners, you know, have sex, get drunk, things like that. Very similar mechanism, the Native American potlatch, where you basically bring out everything you have. The neighbors can come, they can take things, but you keep a mental tab on who's taken what, so that next time there's a crisis, you can go knock on their teepee and say, listen, mate, like you've taken all of these of my things, can you now help me out? And it is socially unacceptable. I mean, I don't know why, right? But it's unacceptable for them to say no, because like the rest of the community would just crucify you. And it's interesting as well, when the American colonization was going on, potlatch was one of the first things that they forbade, because it was one of the things creating resilience amongst the Native American tribes. And
what is it?
So the potlatch, which is this kind of Native American exchange ceremony, it creates such strong bonds with, and it's such an important ritual that when the colonizers came and they were taking over America, they needed to disintegrate these social bonds in order to dominate the local population. So the potlatch was one of the first things that they made illegal, which is really interesting when you see, when we go back to civilizational resilience, how Palaeolithic the basic principles are. Like if you want to dismantle a population, you got to dismantle their gift-giving practices, you know, which is super interesting.
I remember watching something, and a comment stayed with me actually, and he said, in our culture, if you were to reciprocate a gift with something of equal value, the person would be mortified. They would be insulted that you would do that, because what you were signifying to them was that you wanted to cut off the relation, right? Yeah. And the whole idea was that you give something greater than the value of what you've received. And he said, the essence of a gift is its obligation. Yeah. And I don't know why that stayed with me. Because when I give something, I do it out of generosity. Yeah. I don't want anything back. But I have no societal tribal purpose in giving. It's literally just But in that's obviously, gift giving was a function of their community to strengthen a bond. Yes. And so to reciprocate something of a gift of equal value was like frowned upon. It was deeply insulting to do that.
Yeah, because it shows that you're calculating it in your head, right? It was really interesting. I don't know why I went, but I guess it's always good to know what tunes the devil is playing. And I was invited. I'm grateful for the invitation, but you know, I'm not a big fan of institutions, as you can tell. And so it's not like from a political perspective. It's more from an anthropological perspective. I don't like when someone is telling me what to do without me consenting to that being the authority. And we went for this like visit trip into European Parliament, and we listened to the digital plan of theirs, you know, of like digital sovereignty, which is the stuff that I find amusing, like in this day and age when you've got this like digital layer and these kind of like cloud hunter-gatherers essentially like doing their own thing completely. Trying to geopoliticize technology is just hilarious to me, like, you know, but anyway, so that was a whole thing. And we went into Ursula der Leiden's office, right? And there was again, anthropologically fascinating. It was this whole kind of rack of gifts that she had gotten, like from all these like trips, you know, that she went to. And it was really, and you know, when people tell me that archaeology is nonsense and you'll spend your life, you know, serving out French fries and McDonald's and stuff, well, maybe I'd probably be better paid if I did that. But it was all like basically historical art. So it was like from Egypt, you got like this really kitschy looking like bust of Tutankhamun, you know, and there were these like every country gave something basically like historically, archaeologically significant, and you could see the delegations and the planning behind each gift, and it was just so interesting to see how, like, you know, we try to play God with technology and we try to like predict how humanity is going to be flying to Mars and stuff, yet like the gifts are something so primeval, so like Paleolithic. It shows like the true nature of humanity. And it's also quite funny in politics, because I just find politics amusing when the gift giving goes wrong. So I can't remember who this was. I think it was George W. Bush, I think, when he went on a trip to Japan. And I think he gave them like a ceremonial sword or a knife or something. And for the Japanese, it was deeply insulting, because to get anything with a sharp edge, you're basically signifying that you want to kill that person, or that it's like an act of aggression. So it shows that like when you like anthropologically don't get your shit together, basically, you can really even in the 21st century when we should be beyond these things, you can really mortally offend someone, and it can stop, you know, peace talks. It can stop like economic negotiation, like even something so stupid as a gift. So it just shows you like what really makes the world go round, and it's definitely not the godlike tech that we've got at our disposal that can solve anything from cancer to world hunger. It's really Paleolithic, like chimp-like things, like what gifts we give to each other, which is quite funny.
It's interesting that gift giving is such a strong pillar of civilizational resilience, or tribal resilience, or societal resilience in a sort of local context. What are there some other principles or some other kinds of rituals in a similar sense that bind us together or strengthen our resilience? And are there any particular things that undermine our resilience societally?
Yeah, this is $1 million question. We're actually, so we're doing this board game and this card game where we want to create like this collapse simulator, right? So like we like the idea is like to throw in like I don't know, there's the antibiotic supply chain has been broken, you know, what are you going to do about it? Because that's something that could realistically happen. And we've isolated these 12 skills that I think, you know, there's obviously more, like everything's like super reductionist, but we're trying our best. And some of the things are stuff like, you know, like well-being. And I know that sounds a bit like esoteric and like, ugh, but what I'm trying to get at is like things like mental resilience and kind of like being mentally prepared for things like criticism, manipulation. You know, hand in that, we've got another skill, which is decoding symbolism, because we don't even realize like how symbolic the entire world around us is. Like there's, in the Czech Republic now where we're filming this, the elections are coming up, you know, and just the way that it's so funny, like the political parties, they choose colors, right? So like one of the parties has chosen green because green is not associated with any kind of dominant party. If they chose blue, that's too right wing, you know. Red, it's a bit commie, so they went with green. And this is bright green as well. It looks terrible, but you can see how like every single decision around us, from the color scheme to the layout of hotels, like everything's got a huge like symbol behind it. And I think that a lot of us are being like manipulated without even realizing this. So I think like being mentally in a good place, you know, things like not being burnt out, like not being a part of the rat race, like having some kind of mental autonomy, being healthy as well, because you know you get to a situation where you're, for example, reliant on the state from a certain age, which I think is terrible, because like then basically like, you know, you lose your economic autonomy and you're basically reliant on handouts from a centralized like structure. So this over-dependence on the medieval institutions, I think, is fundamentally what's making people into vulnerable individuals. A great example is Iron Age Assyria, where they became like, I mean, this is technological over-reliance, but they became over-reliant on a certain ore that they were mining, and basically when that ran out, the society started to collapse onto itself. So I think a over-reliance on anything, whether that's a technology or a power structure or an institution, is fundamentally what makes you weak, and you need to always have a plan B that you can look after yourself in that given domain. Yeah, so sorry, that's a very like wishy-washy answer, but there's other skills that we have, so like historical awareness, for example. So you know,
it's not really wishy-washy. Yeah. I mean, you're not having a single point of failure is I guess the founding principle of resilience, right?
Yeah.
So not having that, it's a very good example, actually. It's probably as a founding principle of resilience, because whenever I look at it, assessing risk in my life, that's one of the things that I think about from a commercial point of view. If you've only got one source of income, that's a single point of failure. We talk about this with Bitcoin custody as well. Having a single point of failure is not very resilient at all.
Yeah.
And so that decentralized aspect of it can be incorporated into a whole bunch of things in our lives. So
yeah. I actually, sorry, now that you say this, sorry to interrupt, but I've had just another thought. Something that I like find, because humans, like, we are phenomenally adaptable, right? Like, for example, there was a period in our like history where we almost died out, became extinct, many times. And there was like, at one time, like, there was like 6 different species of hominin living at the same time simultaneously. And we were the only kind of like, line that prevailed even over the Neanderthals, etc. And there was this one like, breaking point where we needed to cross one of the channels actually near Australia. And even when the sea levels were at their lowest, it was still about 100 miles of ocean. And in order to survive on the other end, which we did, we needed to have a genetically viable population, which is, 25, 50 specimens, something like this. And we probably didn't have an overly articulated language by this point. And just to be in a situation where you come up against like this ocean that's pretty wild, you've got like lianas, you've got some bark, and you need to have the charisma to convince the other like hominins with you to say, do you know what, we're going to build a raft, we're going to go that way. That's nuts, right? I mean, like, you've got to have a lot of hope, a lot of conviction, a hell of a lot of charisma, and like luck to pull that off. But the fact that we went into such huge risks showed that we were able to conceive of something that we couldn't quite visualize in our minds, like basically go into the unknown. And I feel that, again, this sounds like really motivational, like bullshit chit chat, but I'm gonna tie it back to like our civilization, that I think we are so distracted on the day to day by like jobs, emails, like things that our Paleolithic brains absolutely can't keep track of, and we're always playing catch up, and we no longer can kind of like dream of alternate realities that we don't know exactly what they'll look like yet, but we're willing to take the leap into it. And for me, for example, that's the death of the nation state and a completely different way of social organization. And whenever I talk to even most of my friends, I talk to them about this, they're like, okay, Sara, like you're reading like too much sci-fi.
Well, it is quite a deep thought and concept that being immersed in the daily routine prevents us from imagining something greater.
Yeah.
Right? And as a result of that limits the scope of, or the potential for society, right? We have fewer people engaged in, I guess it's almost like fewer people engaged in dreaming.
Yes.
Aspiring.
Yeah.
The ambition is sucked away from society. Do you think that makes people less receptive to visionaries? I mean that in the sense of visionary leaders, entrepreneurship, political leaders, or does that make them more susceptible to negative versions of those sorts of people?
Ooh, that's a very good question. I actually think it makes them more receptive, but those visionaries are coming out of places that traditional visionaries don't come from, right? So like the traditional definition of visionary is like, a daring scientist or a daring politician or like a really good president.
Well, that used to be the case. We used to lionize and make heroes of scientists. We don't do that anymore. Who's a famous scientist? Fauci's the most famous scientist in the world, right? And what do people think of him now?
Yeah, exactly. Or Jeff Hinton on AI these days, and this is exactly it. And we're back to the medieval institutions thing: is that the places of society that were these visionary, these incubators of visionaries, like academia, that has become. It's like a part of me is in academia. Like I don't really like publish, and I'm because I came from the private sector back into academia. It's not great. Like it's pretty difficult. But you see that you've got these constraints on brains that should be creating these like unknown futures. You've got constraints where they're basically managers. They're not academics anymore. You have to get grants. Grants are fundamentally cartels. Like in my opinion, it's a terrible way that academia is being funded. So you either go to the private sphere, which obviously wants you to say, yes, sugar is good or bad because that's the product we are or are not selling, or you go to the government, which is actually probably doing the same thing. And there's a very few academics that actually have like complete liberty to research whatever they want. So that's kind of struck off, and people are losing their will in the academic world, which obviously you throw the baby out with the bathwater, then you get an aversion to vaccines. And I don't want to politicize this
Yeah,
discussion, but like, what would a medieval peasant give for a vaccine, So like, it's really difficult because suddenly you're politicizing absolutely everything, including academia that's helpful. The same with politics. I mean, I don't think that politics was ever a breeding ground for visionaries, but nonetheless, people don't really trust that anymore. I think it's only about 30% of people that trust like political institutions now. So it's like an all-time low. People don't go to vote anymore, which I actually think is a good thing, but like that's crumbling completely. But you've got kind of new people emerging, like, influencers that command the attention of tens of millions that don't come from these traditional backgrounds. And again, we go back to the Financial Times example that the traditional institutions are lambasting, but actually they've got access to exactly the same information, and they are curating it in a different way. They don't have the history or like the status behind them, but people are listening to them. So I think we do have visionaries, but the economy of experts has changed dramatically, Like, so in the Renaissance, if you went to Leonardo da Vinci, he would probably know about 50% of all there is to know, like, of human knowledge. Since then, the human knowledge and, like, the information out there has, like, I don't know how many times it's increased, but there's absolutely no way that one expert can know everything. I'm an archaeologist. I can't keep up with all the archaeological news, and like so often I'll be in a pub with someone and they'll mention something from archaeology. I'll have no idea, and even though it's something I love and have done my entire life, I can't place myself into a role of an expert. The best thing I can do is ask good questions and ask them well and ask them with conviction, but I can't tell the people like that this is how the truth was and like listen to me, otherwise you're wrong. But somehow that's what we've come to expect of visionaries. And there was this kind of flutter of hope when kind of Silicon Valley and this whole startup world exploded that will use tech for good. But all that's become is a bunch of people with egos who didn't want to go down the road with politics and are going down this road of we'll make a better tomorrow. And whenever I hear that from a tech founder, that kind of I shudder.
Make a better world.
Yeah, exactly.
They stopped saying that, I think, about 5 years ago, and they're just like, just make more money.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. They're just giving up the pretense. Yeah.
You mentioned trust in institutions at a low. I wonder if that's not a good thing. I think it sounds to me like that's a good thing.
Oh yeah.
If it's as a result of a more skeptical and critical public.
Yeah.
But by the same token, it's also a function of incompetence within institutions who have brought about this diminished trust as well.
Yeah.
You're familiar with the concept of anti-fragile systems that gain from chaos and disorder?
Yeah.
So I feel like, okay, if we have a skeptical public, as crises emerge, okay, it's a lot harder to tell what's what, but then you train the muscle to be a more discerning consumer of information. And I think that has happened as a result of COVID, but also what's happened is there are these factions within society who are highly trained propagandists, like independent propagandists. So they choose a side and they're very good at just pushing out and messaging according to the side that they choose now. So like, I'm not sure if that makes us more or less resilient. I can't really quite tell at the moment, but my disposition is for more decentralization and a more hyper-aware, vigilant consuming public.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. I think it's a good thing, right? The problem is that in the past, decentralization was a kind of symbol of collapse, right? So 2 years ago, we went to Guatemala with the help of AI and like LiDAR, and then kind of running that 3D topography map through a neural network. We managed to find a almost 3,000 years old city in the jungle, which was amazing. And I heard about this project. I'm like, I'm coming whether you like it or not. So like, I'm an archaeologist. I'm an armchair archaeologist, right? So I like comment on it grandly from beautiful chairs. But like the last dig I was on was in Botswana in like 2011. So I haven't actually dug for a really long time, but I was like, I'm coming with you guys. So I was there more like an accessory. It's the guys that went that were like really they were awesome. Like it was a Czech, Slovak, Guatemalan kind of triumvirate kind of digging it. Milan Kovac, hello to you, has been digging in the area for 15 years. And we found what is probably the one of the oldest Maya cities ever discovered in the jungle, which is phenomenal. And it existed until very, very late, like the kind of post-classic, so almost until like the arrival of the Spanish. And you see that the Maya, they really grew into this huge kind of centralized state around like, the 7th century, 8th century, and then suddenly came almost immediate collapse. And I was asking like, well, but is a collapse, is it necessarily a bad thing? Like people like Jared Diamond talk about like collapse being bad. And I think it's a very linear way of understanding it because, yeah, you have fragmentation and you might have kind of less monumental architecture, but monumental architecture doesn't mean resilience, right? That doesn't mean a successful civilization. You had the Sea People who didn't even have connected writing and they almost completely obliterated Ramses II, so like decentralization can still mean immense power. Just archaeologically it's difficult to tell from the record because all you have is pyramids to look at, right?
Can I share something with you?
Yeah,
it's an idea. I mean, I've thought about like decentralization probably benefits for persistence. And centralization is when you have a mission, like a purpose.
Yeah.
So like a centralized army is going to take any territory they want against a decentralized army. But that decentralized army will persist for much longer.
Yeah.
So like the centralized army has so many weaknesses. It could run out of food, the weather, anything could happen to them, right? They could have disease because they're all together. And so their ability to persist is greatly diminished, I think, or is more at threat by being together in the face of something like the things that I just mentioned. Whereas a decentralized army or a decentralized anything, it benefits the ability for a system to persist in the face of a threat, but it won't necessarily be able to overcome a single threat in and of itself. Or defeat the threat in and of itself?
Yeah.
Do you think that holds water? I'm not sure how watertight that idea is, but it's something that sort of lingered in my mind for a while. I don't know how to test it though.
It's a really good point because you won't decentralize, you won't thrive, you'll survive, right?
That's right.
So it's
you'll
like
persist.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like kind of like the rats in the catacombs. You survive, but you're not necessarily going to. Well, like speaking of catacombs, I mean that's what happened with the Christians in the Roman Empire. Like there was a period where they were literally like hiding underground outside of the city walls, in their kind of burial catacombs, like away from sight. And then in 313, Constantine the Great made Christianity the official. So I think it's playing the waiting game, and it's like mammals when the dinosaurs died out. They were like in these little burrows, like very insignificant, but that doesn't mean that you're not going to become dominant at some point. So I think for me, survival always trumps like short-term thriving because you get to build your pyramids, you get to build monumental architecture, but inevitably there's only down to go from a certain point, right? So I think it's important to maintain both of those things and having that parallelity. So thriving to build great things and do amazing things, but at the same time, never forgetting to teach people how to survive on a basic level. But of course, if you're in that ruling position, you don't want people to survive independent of you, right? Because you need them to build those pyramids for you. So it's a narrative problem. And
that's where they use cultural things and narratives to coerce, or not even coerce, I guess, to compel. They're people, once they buy into a cultural narrative, they feel a duty to the pharaoh to dedicate their entire lives and build the pyramid, for example, right? So you can control them materially and get them to buy in into a cultural narrative that gets them to act and dedicate themselves. Exactly, and get them addicted to the scale. I think the scale addiction is a huge problem with these civilizations because, just going back to the Maya briefly, you basically had a situation in the archaeological record where it's like if you had Trafalgar Square and suddenly had small gardening colonies across them, what once were these huge squares of the kings, in these huge kind of ceremonial areas, suddenly after the collapse, you see that people would plant their own little fields, and do their own thing. But in parallel with that, you see from the archaeological record of the bones that actually those people are probably pretty malnourished. And you see, building this monumental architecture, something very similar you see during the reign of Amenhotep IV or Akhenaten, who did this big shift from polytheism to monotheism in Egypt. And he created this huge new center, Amarna, and it was very full of splendor, etc. It was meant to be that cultural narrative to motivate the people to kind of take on this new civilization and to really support it. And you had
had this big splendor, but at the same time, again, you had this heavy malnourishment, like disfigurement of like people and the bones. And I think that the moment that the average person becomes dependent on the system and like addicted to the idea of the civilization, that's when resilience dies. So
what's the best documented case of a great civilization collapsing? What can you take us through the timeline in a sort of narrative? What happened? Why were they great?
Yeah.
And how did it lead to their eventual collapse? Like, what happened in the collapse? Because I'm fascinated by this. There have been many great civilizations that have, but I don't really truly understand, or I'm not aware of that end-to-end narrative. Can you tell us a little bit about an example of a great civilization that's collapsed?
Yeah, so we can, there's the meme, like, that's my Roman Empire, so let's go with the Roman Empire. Sure. I mean, it's closest to us culturally. So the Roman Empire, you had the founding of Rome in 753, I think, BC, yeah. Romulus and Remus, which is quite funny because actually the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire was also called Romulus, so it's quite like a cool kind of 360. And
was that in fact who founded that, or was that founded in mythology about who founded Rome?
It's a good question. So you have the Aeneid, who that basically talks about these kind of leftovers from the Trojan War, and then because the Greeks, Magna Graecia, they were kind of expanding onto what is today's Italy and what then became the Roman Empire. So you had the Etruscans, you had the Greeks. So there's a whole kind of like we didn't find the bodies of either Romulus or Remus, obviously, but I think it's one of those mythologies that's actually pretty well grounded in reality in one way or another. But basically, you first had a kingdom, then you had the Romans expanding over the rest of basically like consolidating the territory and the tribes and the very disparate cultures that lived in what is now Italy, kind of expanding until you had the Republic. And then the Republic became very kind of, holier than thou. It was kind of very democratic. Of course, it wasn't. You had the populares and the optimates. So the optimates were like the aristocracy, the elite, and then you had the populares who were much more populist. And then suddenly you had the emergence of a rogue, in this case Julius Caesar, who was hugely inspired by Alexander the Great. There's even this, if you feel like you haven't achieved much and you're feeling FOMO, Julius Caesar actually once saw in a shrine this statue of Alexander the Great, and like he fell to his knees, like weeping that by the age of like 32 he hadn't accomplished so much, and what have I done with my life? So it's quite funny. We all go through the same emotions, and basically suddenly you had this general who had these incredible victories in the provinces. So the period of Asterix in Gaul. Probably a bit of a genocide. Like there's 2 million deaths like mentioned. Like I don't know whether that was like the ancients just like glorifying the figures, but suddenly you had this twist where you had this almost like modern European way of like from the kingdom into the republic, and it's kind of like a very, even by today's standards, like modern way of governing. And suddenly you had this kind of like guy come in from the side and basically like challenge the status quo. And one of the reasons why he was there was a civil war like attached to the fact that he was doing what he was doing. He crossed the Rubicon. There was the reason why that was considered like such a huge breach is that because the Roman Senate basically said that Rubicon is one of those kind of geopolitical boundaries that if someone crosses, you basically are in a state of like internal unrest and like potential civil war.
It's considered an attack on Rome.
Exactly.
If you march your soldiers beyond that river.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
Okay.
Then he started Julius Caesar attaching these symbols to him. So he started wearing purple, which because of the fact that purple is very difficult to create, it was associated with kings, etc., etc. And so they thought, he's a challenge to the system. So we better kill him and save the Republic. And there's this beautiful meme, with Thanos talking to, what did it cost? Everything. So it's, did you kill Julius Caesar? Yes. What did it cost? The Republic. So ironically, they killed him. It resulted in another civil war in the Second Triumvirate, and basically you had suddenly the Roman Empire be created. So it's funny because we think of a very linear progression to society, from like the feudal to the very democratic, but the Romans, they went from decentralized to kind of sort of feudal to very democratic to completely imperial. And then the empire basically stretched so far, and I think pretty thin, I think for me, the biggest breaking point came that, we already mentioned Christianity and the Edict of Milan, where the Romans were genius in the sense that they would go to the provinces, they had different kind of categories of cities, and they would let the locals live their lives, so like live and let live. So a beautiful example from Britain, for example, in Bath, you have the Baths of Sulis Minerva. So they would have the Roman goddess, but they would also have the local god, and they would kind of amalgamate the two to give the locals a feeling that, that they're not taking over culturally. They didn't even make it like illegal to challenge Rome, like from a symbolic perspective, right? So if you wanted to have your own gods, your own belief, that was totally fine by them. The only kind of problem was if anyone challenged their power, because the power was what was holding on to the empire and fundamentally the military might. So that's actually the interesting thing about Jesus Christ being crucified. It wasn't because of the Christianity. No one gave a damn. There was so many prophets back in the day. The problem was he called himself the King of the Jews. So suddenly you had someone else who was saying that he's got political authority, which was the problem for Rome. And then because like over time, like this polytheistic let live was eroded, the moment that Constantine created an official religion, I think that's when everything went to shit, pardon my French, because you basically had this huge territory that was suddenly like being forced upon like a way of life and a certain culture, and I think that was basically the end of the beginning. You then had things like the tetrarchy, so you had like multiple. You had fragmentation, so you had like multiple emperors ruling at the same time. Then eventually you had the split between the West and the Roman Empire and the East Roman Empire, which eventually became like Byzantium, although they never really called themselves that. And then you had the sacking of Rome, I think 476, and then eventually you had the sacking of Constantinople in 1453. So in a way you could say that Rome was actually incredibly successful because it went on from like 750, three or six, until 1453. And of course you could say that actually Rome survived until today because thanks to the Renaissance, which in French is rebirth. If you look at any kind of banking buildings or government buildings, they will have a Roman urbanistic structure because we went through this kind of Roman revival, and that's what we root a kind of modern law, modern political systems in. So in a way, the idea of Rome is still completely governing us now. If you go into society, if you go into a pub and you're trying to make an impression of someone, you will say something in Latin, which is quite funny because Julius Caesar, when he crossed the Rubicon, he didn't say aliacta est, he said it but in ancient Greek, so it was like if you say something in Latin, he was showing off to his troops, so he would say it in ancient Greek. So the idea of Rome has survived until now. It's very cool to know about it. It's very cool to understand the history. So as a meme, the Roman Empire is one of the most successful things in the world because as a meme, it basically survived. When it came to it as a governing structure, it went through so many iterations that to actually say the end of the Roman Empire, you wouldn't be able to.
You wouldn't be able to delineate the end of that.
No,
it persisted long after, right?
Yeah, exactly.
In various forms.
Yeah, and like Gibbons, like in the I think 18th century, wrote this like seminal work on the fall of the Roman Empire, and there were so many theories from like lead piping to internal struggles, etc. But actually, Rome has survived pretty successfully until now.
Elaborate on that.
So like Napoleon, when Napoleon came into power, one of the things that he had as a symbol was the Napoleonic bee, which went back to the time of Marcus Aurelius, who used to, the Stoic philosopher, the philosophic emperor, who used to compare Rome to, like the Roman Empire, to a beehive, and what's good for the beehive is good for the bees, that kind of like narrative. And so you can even see that in some of the Roman architecture. You get these hexagons, like the bee houses, or you know what I mean, like where beehive. Beehive. Yeah, God, yeah, where bees live.
The honeycomb, right?
The honeycomb, that's
design,
it. Yeah,
right.
thank you. Which, by the way, is a very resilient structure. We're going back to resilience. Like these very clever emperors were very good at taking things from nature that are resilient and kind of culturally, story-wise, painting it onto the civilization. So when Napoleon came into power, which is a whole other hilarious thing, that you would have the French saying, oh no, we got to get rid of the Bourbon kings and the elites, chop their heads off, then chop the heads of the revolutionaries and literally get an emperor into the position. It's hilarious how short-sighted like humans are, but anyway. And he needed to get rid of the cultural memory of the Bourbons. So he removed the Bourbon lily, which is something, for example, the Scouts have as a symbol. He got rid of that and he replaced it by the Napoleonic bee, which went all the way back to Rome. And if you see, like, if you walk around Paris and you see like the Napoleonic N, or like, you know, even his tomb in Les Invalides, you've got the laurel wreath around it, which is kind of symbolic of Julius Caesar. And when Wellington then beat him in the Battle of Waterloo, one of the kind of things that he took back home with him into Britain as like into his war chest was this statue of Napoleon, and I think it was Jupiter, I think, but like so he literally like would have himself depicted as a Roman god when he was crowned emperor. He would have a laurel wreath on his head. So Rome has been very successful in like pervading society, even like, you know, 2,000 years on, which is fascinating to me.
It's interesting that the cultural remnants persist.
Yeah.
But the governance structure completely collapsed. So it's like the urge to control, or the desire to control, the structures that controlled collapse, but the soft power persists even till this day, 2,000 years later.
Yeah, and it's almost like we're cosplaying the past, you know, which is why I think, again, archaeology is so important, because archaeology is stories fundamentally. And, you know, if you look at, I mean, I'm no lawyer, but my best friend from uni days is a lawyer. And I remember in first year, it was funny because we would do like ancient Rome and he did Roman law. And because I was interested in it, I was just reading on like the history of it. And basically when Napoleon did his Code Civil, the kind of, because he wanted to basically put like a structure onto like the new way he was governing France and trying to govern Europe, he would create this code to basically give himself like a sense of history, right? Because he was a new kid to the block, but the way that he kind of rooted himself very deeply was twofold. You got to create some kind of like structure that seems important enough that it seems long-standing, so it gives you legitimacy. And he made academia his bitch. Like, you know, when he went on his Egyptian campaign, he took like half of the academic ensemble from Paris with him and basically founded the discipline of Egyptology, like the cartographers that came with him. So the moment you've got the support of academia and you've got some kind of like big complex system around you, and you change the symbols, that gives you a sense of like, oh, I've always been here. I've always done this. You know, like look at me. I'm rooted in history through and through. Although he was this random dude from Corsica. So yeah. Sorry, I was just trying to say that like we often, and what Napoleon did is basically cosplay the Roman Empire, but he did it brilliantly, and it actually, I think, was a huge part of his success. And we do that now. You look at any political campaign, they kind of go back to the origins of the nation. It's very kind of rooted in history. The Burberry coat, you know, the brand Burberry, when they were tanking at the start of this millennium, they went back to the trenches where the original Burberry coat came from, and they would like, a part of their PR campaign show like archives from like 1917 of like the British chap, like the British officer wearing a Burberry trench coat, and that meant partially their stock went back up because suddenly it was like, oh, that's very traditionally British, you know, that's very historical. So history holds great value, and like we cosplay it a lot, I think, which is why it's so important to learn about it.
So I guess when using the Roman Empire as an example of something that's a civilization that's failed, but I wonder whether or not the scale that they reached, that would have been inevitable, and whether or not the catalyst you pointed to, which was, did you say the adoption of Christianity?
Oh, I mean, like that's just, you know, my personal opinion. Sure, like there's so many
because people have
factors.
lots of different ideas, right?
Yeah.
Some people say it was it was the money, for example, like especially within Bitcoiner circles. That's a very strong narrative that's pushed. I guess it suits us as well because, you know, it ties in with everything. But I wonder, like at some point when you take over everything, there's nothing left to take over, right? Within the realm of, I guess they had the Middle East all the way through to Western Europe. Yeah. And then at some point, like there's nothing really left to take over, right? And so I wonder whether or not it was inevitable that would collapse upon itself.
Oh, 100%. Like, you know, we spoke about this earlier, that like if you reach a high point, you've got no way to go but down. And I think that this is the trap of power structures being rooted in like geography. I think that's nuts because like right now we're in a situation where like for example, the network state I think has a lot of flaws, but like people arrange themselves in these tribes, and like we already do it. Like
are you talking about Balaji's concept of the
I'm not. Yeah, I'm not a huge. I see where he's going with it, but I think that it's basically just replicating the problems that nation state does just in cyberspace. So it's super interesting. Don't get me wrong, but I think that we need to like think of like a sense of belonging in a completely different way. That yes, you've got the geopolitical reality, but there have been a lot of civilizations. I mentioned the Sea People, who was basically like this amalgamation of like these random tribesmen. They didn't even speak the same language, and they just actually there's an argument that they maybe even came from Bohemia, and they just said, you know what, let's go in this direction. And just like they didn't have common writing, they left behind almost no archaeological record, but they were one of the most powerful forces in the Mediterranean ever. And so for me, for example, the idea of thalassocracies, which is the like seafaring nations, is hugely interesting because like you get to move around, you're very kind of agile, you can be very diverse without making a like political thing out of it. Like you're naturally just diverse because like you amalgamate from a lot of different areas. And any civilization for me that I think was actually very kind of persistent, but not necessarily one of the great ones that you get in history books because they didn't leave behind monumental architecture or things to go in museums, which is how traditionally archaeologists have seen value in a civilization. It's like how much gold can you expose in a museum, right? Well, what are you going to expose about the Sea Peoples? Not much because they didn't leave anything behind really. But whether it was the Phoenicians or pirates or the Sea People or the Chinese, like when they had their huge warships, like when we were still kind of almost climbing trees here in Europe. Whenever they kind of went into the sea, I think people have become a lot more resilient, adaptive. Or like the Venetian Republic. Like the Venetian Republic was a tiny bit like in the marshes made out of people who were exiled after kind of Rome collapsed, and they existed for 1,100 years. Like it's nuts, like the scale that they were able to achieve. So thalassocracy for me is an interesting way of organization.
The fall of Rome, the empire, was that distinct from like the fall of Rome as a city, the collapse of Rome as a great city? Because there's lots of talk about the collapse of Rome as a city. The economy of Rome at one point was huge, then it wasn't able to sustain itself. Like, did that have a different catalyst?
Oh yeah, it's an interesting.
Or was it tied to the fortunes of empire?
I think it was like a symbolic. You cut off the head. I mean, like the symbolism of Rome. The eternal city. Like it wasn't. I think necessarily like strategically too important. Like you could see this at the end of the Second World War when the Allies were going up through Italy, and there was it was just before the D-Day landings, and they were not meant to go through Rome. Like they told them like don't bother. It's like it's not important. But the American general who was, after Patton had been sacked, who was heading it, said, no, we have to go through Rome, because if we take Rome, then, that is, we've taken the core of the city. And I think that the fall of the Roman Empire was, we see in 476, with the sack of Rome, we see that as the end, but it really wasn't, because like some of those people who, as I mentioned, went into exile, went and then created Venice. So Venice you could understand as a continuation of Rome. It was just in a different place, but because it's so attached to the Roman architecture, to the romance of the place, then it's seen as a cut-off point. But in reality, I think it was much more of a transformation. And of course, Constantinople lived on, which was a lot more Roman in many ways. Rome kind of became a caricature of itself in a certain way.
I guess we can bring it to the modern day and back to our initial subject, which is civilizational resilience, particularly in relation to the new technologies that we're seeing. Artificial intelligence, robotics, for example. I had this discussion the other day with an entrepreneur, and I said, as an entrepreneur, I'm absolutely exhilarated with the potential of both robotics and artificial intelligence, more so AI, to be honest. But when I look around at the potential impact to society and the collapse of labour demand, I'm absolutely terrified about the consequences of that. And so I guess, how do you see those two technologies? So we've discussed the internet a little bit, but I think this is almost nascent. We're not even sure what the impact's going to be. How do you think that'll affect our resilience? as a society, as world population?
Yeah, that's a big one. I think I came up with a quote because every good pretend visionary's got to have a quote, and it's that civilizational resilience starts the moment that the symbol dies, and what I mean by that is like the moment that all the bullshit that we're surrounded by, all the symbolism, all those gods, and whether that's a god in the sense of Rome, the city, the huge symbol, or the president, or whatever like people perceive as like the symbol, or a meme that is like in it, like capturing so much power and so much like byproduct control. The moment that goes away, and the moment people start thinking a lot more rationally and start actually like answering the questions and solving the problems at hand, I think that's when like civilizational resilience actually begins. I don't think that we can ever really reach that point, but we can get maybe incrementally closer to it. And I think with the rise of AI, you basically are completely changing the value economy, because suddenly you can have people writing blogs, people creating content, people, if you put your mind to it, you can start 4 companies a day, really. Like you can do pretty much anything, right? And suddenly the gatekeeping of, we go back to the beginning, of information, of know-how, etc., that suddenly like loses the value that it had, and like the value suddenly becomes in actually being human, having emotional intelligence, being good company, being fun, like all these things that were actually seen as just like these side things until now, is what I think is going to become ultimately valuable. And it's not going to be like, how many cool blogs can you write about X per day, because it's probably an AI writing it anyway. You just have it attached to your profile picture. So I actually think that people are going to become much more critical in a good way. So when I hear the arguments, for example, that AI is going to make us, dumber, is going to make us more susceptible to fake news. Actually, for the first time ever of me being on the internet, when I go into the comment section of like any bit of content, the discussion that you see is like, oh, is this AI? Was this generated by AI? People are actually a lot more skeptical towards content than they have been in the past. And people are not difficult to fool. Like in the 1873, I think there was this thing that because the telescopes and like the lenses were for the first time by manufacture, you could have these like industry-grade telescopes that you could kind of map the moon with, and there was this bit of fake news that there's these unicorns and flying people on the moon, and people are like, yeah, that sounds realistic. So people are not like difficult to fool, and paradoxically, I think that with AI, people are actually like being more skeptical and asking the right questions, which is great. So I think it's going to have a huge effect in the sense that the human will cease being a part of like the human abacus, which is designed to keep the civilization, which needs a lot of energy to survive at that scale, alive. And it's going to give way to people kind of like breaking off and fragmenting and doing their own thing and being much more emancipated. But it's not going to be an easy journey. I think there's going to be a lot of fight back from the civilizational status quo.
I'm wondering about the journey. Yeah, I'm not yet convinced of the net positive effect of that. I can see the productivity angle, everything like that, but now I just think, well, actually at some point, like what happens to all those people who lose jobs? And people say, well, we'll just create new industries. We've always gone through this. I say, yeah, but the new industries won't need people. Yeah. Right? That's the whole purpose of AI and robotics.
Yeah.
Combined is that you don't need people to think, and you don't need people to do. The manual labour is not required. Manual labour with a brain as well. So it's like, okay, so where's that demand for people? There is a finite need for charismatic individuals to create entertainment content or anything that's kind of creative, authoritative. I think there's a finite demand for that. And in any case, who's going to pay for it if people don't have jobs?
And
if they don't have a purpose?
Yeah. That's what amazing that you mentioned this, because you went back to like the stories and like how civilizations maintain themselves. And one of the, I think it was Jared Diamond again, but he claimed that one of the biggest issues or like breaking points and problems that humanity did was start farming, because basically you went through like 99% of our existence we spent as hunter-gatherers, right? And you did have a purpose, obviously, like within the tribe, but it was very fluid. It was a very fluid organization. And suddenly, so for example, there was this beautiful study that was published that, for example, ADHD was hugely evolutionary beneficial in hunter-gatherers because you could quickly iterate your strategy and you could actually be very fluid because you didn't have to do one thing for the whole day, right? And your purpose was very varied. But the moment that we started farming and you become sedentary, you have to start glorifying boredom. You have to start glorifying...
Hang on.
Oh, yeah.
But you think farming led to sedentary lifestyles? The advent of farming?
Yeah. I think so. Because basically to keep... Because if you're hunting-gatherer, you're never going to scale, but you're going to be able to move very quickly, which is the main evolutionary benefit, is that you can't really exhaust one place. Like you can move on and you can fragment and you can come together again, and it's a very fluid social organization.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we're using different... I use a modern definition of sedentary where it's just Norm on the couch watching TV. That's sedentary.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Oh, I mean like...
stationary.
Stationary,
I see,
sedentary
okay.
as in like fixed in one place. Sorry.
Yeah.
And so basically like before where ADHD was a huge benefit because you could like go to new places, like you could like diversify your strategies. If you're a farmer, you don't have the luxury to diversify your strategy. Like that thing needs to grow, right? And you need to watch over it until it grows. And if it doesn't, the guy from the house next to you is going to like kick your ass because you're not feeding his family, right? Yeah. But basically, like there comes a stage where you think to yourself as a human being who's used to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle and whose brain is wired towards that, you start thinking, this is boring as shit. I don't want to do this. I don't want to watch carrots grow for most of the year. And you start to ask those questions, why can't I go back and be a hunter-gatherer? Like, why do I have to do this with you guys? And that's when the social and cultural pressure comes in. And that's when, the gods come in and the kind of, I call it like institutional blackmailing is like, oh, but like if you suffer, it's for the good, and suffering makes you stronger and like all that shit. And it's been going on for like, comparatively to the existence of Homo sapiens for actually quite a short time. But the meme is, and I'm using the meme in the Dawkins sense, that like meme as a cultural piece of information, like a transmission. Yep. It's so powerful to say like, oh, suffering is good, get that bread, work, toiling away, like burn out. There's a glorification of that. And if you don't buy into that, then you're like a freeloader or you're, no, I don't think you are. Wanting to have a nice life and wanting to sit on a beach with your family and not doing anything, that doesn't mean that you don't have a purpose. It means that, they're not paying your taxes and you're not keeping that particular society that you've been assigned to at birth alive. But who gives a damn about that? I don't particularly want to pay taxes. So I think we're at this... we're at this cusp where basically like the glory and suffering and almost like this like Judeo-Christian kind of like aspect of being a martyr for the benefit of the greater good, that's slowly kind of like dying away. And I think we're going back to the hunter-gatherer lifestyle, but with the added like cyberspace to it, which we didn't have before. So I think that is going to fundamentally make these kind of like big sedentary entities, stationary entities obsolete because people are just going to do what feels comfortable for them.
Well, I think that ties back to what you mentioned earlier about the diminishing trust in institutions. And we have, I guess the last 20 years is the creation of a generation towards whom institutions have abdicated their part of the bargain. And we're seeing a whole generation of people in the UK, less so in Australia, but certainly in America, who have gone through the path that they were told to follow, and all they've been left with is a huge student debt and no job. No viable pathway to actually paying that off. Because those high-paying jobs just aren't there. Even those well-paying jobs, let alone high-paying jobs, are just not there in the numbers that they were promised. And they've been saddled with these debts. And I guess, yes, there is an element of personal responsibility to that. That's all well and good, but there's certainly also a societal obligation. What's brought those circumstances about? So in the United States, if you're indebted if you have any kind of debt and you go bankrupt, that debt's wiped off. But student debt is not. It's essentially, it's debt for life, right? And so they were promised roles, right? They were promised jobs that would help them pay that off. But if you've got universities as gatekeepers and ticket clippers, and they're saddling young people with these debts, well then doesn't society bear some kind of responsibility towards those people who have been pushed through that system?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because it wasn't apparent when those people entered the system that there would not be jobs. It's only now the last 5 or 10 years, not even the last 5 or so years, that it's become really clear that there are no jobs left.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
The economy is not generating the jobs for those people, and universities have still been pushing the delusion and the illusion that there will be, that university is a path to a better life. And it's just not turning out that way.
No, not at all. And like we're almost going back to like this narrative of Plato or like the Financial Times you mentioned earlier. And it's this economy of authority. You know, I went to Oxford, which was like the happiest time of my life because like it was an intellectually very free place. It was actually very decentralized internally, which is I think one of the reasons why Oxford has survived for so long as a university. That is diversified into tiny colleges, etc. But sorry, I would digress. I absolutely loved it. But yeah, I do have to ask myself the question: why is that the ultimate kind of like stamping authority? Why does not? Because I've definitely come across people who didn't go to Oxford and who are so much smarter than me, and who asked me curveball questions where I was like, damn, I have no idea about this. One of those examples was I was giving a talk to these kids. It was like this 14-year-old kid who asked me this archaeology curveball question. I was like, damn, like who am I to talk to you guys? Like you guys know some of this stuff so much better than me. And I think that we're in this like schizophrenia where people need to pay their rent. They don't care about these like grandiose theories because they're like, we need to put our kid through school, we need to pay rent, we need to buy food, and what are we going to do? And then you've got the institutions that are creating jobs and creating like this like linear system that is incredibly medieval, that is jumping through the hoops until like you get to pension and then you die and then you're relying on the state, and simultaneously the state is crumbling under the effects of technology, and it's just a mess. And like the people I think are just waiting to be told the next step, and they feel an obligation to like their tribe. But who is your tribe? And I don't think that that's a nation necessarily. And I think that that's the narrative that's going to be changing a lot in the coming maybe years.
Yeah, I believe in personal responsibility, but I also believe in effective policy as well. Like I don't believe in no government. I know I'm not a libertarian, but a lot of libertarians sort of they dominate this space. I'm not a libertarian. But I believe in certain principles of libertarianism, like personal responsibility. But by the same token, I do believe in effective policy as well. I don't believe in no policy.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think policy, a concerted effort over many decades, was made to craft a perception that a certain pathway would lead to a better life. And our institutions were gatekeepers, that if you didn't get a degree, many of our largest organisations or companies would not even look at your job application, right? And so it's one of the reasons I went to university. Now, for the pure purpose of education, you don't even need to go to university. You could have studied everything you studied at Oxford, everything. It's all available online. But it's a matter of, would you be able to curate a curriculum for yourself? Right?
Yeah.
And just by following your curiosity and whatnot. And I feel the same way about my useless business degree as well, right? So it's like, it's a pretty mediocre degree, but I didn't need that just to learn. I didn't need to go to university just to learn all of that. But luckily I graduated at a point where I was able to get into a good job, and, pay off debts and all the rest of that. But now that's no longer the case. I wonder, like, there is a sort of societal bargain, and I think the institutions have failed their end.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's a really good thing that you say is a bargain is different to a social contract. So I don't like the term social contract because it gives an obligation, to the citizen to kind of like pay their dues, like
Well, there is no social contract.
No, exactly.
It's just a concept in someone's mind.
Exactly. But the bargain, I think, is interesting because that means that gives both sides like the same amount of power, and it also gives this idea of a dynamic that like the moment one side stops working, you can kind of renegotiate. But there's no way to renegotiate right now. Like and so my problem is I'm not a libertarian either. I don't know what I am. I don't
have a fixed ideology. No, I don't.
Exactly. I don't have a.
I don't know how some people do, but good luck. Good luck to them.
Exactly.
They have the conviction, but I don't. I pick and choose.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing that matters most to me is freedom and consent. So like in a relationship, you know, like consent is the most important thing. And like, so if you don't have consent as an institution, like from the people that you're governing, and you're like kind of putting more and more power and directions on them, and basically like squeezing them hard, and like if they fail in the system, you don't actually look after them, like you destroy them, you know, and like the individual death or like the individual ruined life just becomes a statistic. Like that's what I have a problem with, you know. Like to give it a concrete example, my granddad, bless him, you know, he passed away during COVID, and he caught COVID in the hospital, which I'll never forgive them for. And you know, they didn't even call us that he was like deteriorating, and then they called us being like, "Hey, he's gonna die in about 10 minutes. Do you want to come over?" I was like 2 hours away, right? So we came, and he'd already passed away, and they were so nonchalant. It's like this dehumanization. Like, and they were so nonchalant. They just gave me a plastic bag of his belongings, and I went like this shitty, depressing Santa Claus out of the hospital with this plastic bag over my shoulder, thinking that's someone who's, you know, paid his dues, paid his taxes, paid his national insurance, all that jazz, and all that he ends up is just like some number and a plastic bag, like really? And that's my problem with these institutions. They, you know, the Neanderthals, they looked better after they're weak and feeble, better than we do. They had a better welfare state. You know, you had these, like the Kafes cave from Israel, which is like, you know, I think 80,000 years BC, and you have these, or 60,000, and you have these skulls of really old Neanderthals where you have the teeth, no teeth, but their jaws have kind of healed over, which means that someone was bringing them food but also chewing the food for them. And they're clearly like lying down like immobile, and someone was chewing the food for them and keeping them alive long enough for the bone to heal over the fact that their teeth fell out. So even small groups, they were not like dog eat dog, they looked after each other. So I think that this whole sense of welfare and looking after one another, that's not a luxury that comes with a big society. That's like humans, I think, fundamentally do look after each other. The moment that this kind of like top-down manipulation comes into it, that's when like the human individuality and freedom and liberty gets eroded. And that's my problem with these big systems, that in order to survive, they have to treat a certain part of the population as a statistic. And that's so dehumanizing for me. I think that this whole like cloud hunter-gatherer aspect is interesting, but in order for that to happen, the states have to be willing to let go of their population, you know, and leave them to economically migrate somewhere else, get a citizenship elsewhere. And obviously they don't want to do that because it's like Spotify getting rid of people who paid subscription, right? So I think that education and like the good spreading of open source information to people and letting them know the way that they can, for example, economically migrate to another area, you know, pack their family up and go, and vote with their feet. I think that is the only way that you can hold these big institutions to check. And it happened before, like, you know, when the Irish migrated to America, or the Italians, like, just because you're from a, say, poorer demographic doesn't mean that you don't have the luxury to pack up and leave. It's just difficult to get that information. And right now, the people who are these country hackers are usually quite like technologically literate. They know what they're doing, and it's a very small proportion of society. And the ones that I feel are locked in to these dysfunctional states are precisely the people who are at the risk of losing their jobs, you know, and they have to make money for the next rent. But those are the ones that should be escaping, I think, somewhere else.
I see the people who are looking to do that right now are, I don't like using the word, but they're probably the most privileged people in society doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And it's the people with the fewest options in a society who are stuck.
Yes.
And I guess we're doing that with, you know, tax domiciles, revenue, redirection, passports. I mean, I'm guilty of that. I've got numerous passports. That's through birth, and I've earned through residency my British passport as well. But people who are not successful in a particular society, they have the least number of options. So it's interesting because historically, so my parents, they're from Turkey originally, and they went to Melbourne in pursuit of opportunity. Because, you know, when they left, Turkey was a really poor country. You know, it's kind of a middling to upper middle sort of on the scale of prosperity amongst nations now. But at one point, it was really, really quite poor. And we see a similar sort of pattern of immigration from most of Europe to the so-called New World, you know, the United States, Australia, New Zealand. So most of the people who left were the really poor people who didn't have the opportunities, whereas now it's reversed. And I wonder what kind of effect that would have on a society. Is it that they're just going to export their legal status and then maintain the personal benefits of their domicile, right?
Yeah, that's a very...
And I question the ethics of that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, no, I agree with you because, again, from archaeological records, whenever a country was going to shit, basically, it was the poor that had nothing to lose, and they would be the ones that would leave, right? So, like, you saw that as well. I was mentioning the Maya city that we discovered in the jungle. They at one point they migrated from the highlands into the lowlands, and then they migrated out again. Like when the system would collapse, it would be the poor who would pack up and leave. It was the kings who were stuck because they needed all those people to work for them, basically, like to keep them alive. And as you say, like the kind of like digital nomads and the people who are becoming these cloud hunter-gatherers, as I call them, they're in a very privileged position, whether from the position of information, but with that usually comes kind of more financial liberty as well. So one of the things that we want to actually achieve, for example, with this Civilization Resilience card game, is to mimify this, like almost like this prepper mentality, but not in the sense I'm storing tins and like hoarding toilet paper, but actually like very simply telling poor people, look, if you want to pack up and leave, it's possible. Like you're not stuck, and you can do this, and these are the steps in which you can do this. So
the dichotomy of a situation in the United States, for example, where you have millions of undocumented people literally doing the labor with no rights. And the wealthy who are able to export their legal status, with respect to revenue, taxation, treatment, all the rest of that, and even perhaps their citizenship as well, but stay and enjoy all of the benefits. I just thought that's a rather dystopian thing where you've got people who are treated almost like non-humans, and then people who are even just beyond the state and their obligations to it.
Yeah, you're right. Like, honestly, and like this is just anecdotal evidence, right? I'm not like claiming to have like a blueprint, because I think anyone who claims to have a blueprint is a very dangerous and deranged individual. So it's just an opinion. But I was teaching like this AI class, and like I didn't want to teach prompting and stuff, because I think it's just like nonsense. So I was like trying to teach more of like a, say, mindset shift, which again sounds really waffly, but I think that's what's needed in order for AI to actually, like help and do its thing. And it was interesting when I was talking to these people, what we did was actually like not really tech knowledge at all. It was more like psychotherapy. And I was talking to this woman who was like maybe in her 50s, and I was saying, actually, if you start your own company, you're going to be you're going to keep doing exactly the same job, but you're going to be making so much more money, because right now she was like on this commission multi-level marketing kind of model, and she was sending most of her money away. And so we calculated it, and she was like, oh yeah, this actually makes a lot of sense. But she's like, but can I do that? Can I like screw over this multi-level marketing company that I'm working for? And I was like, yeah, because they don't give a shit about you. And it's happened so many times to me that actually, when we talk like this, we think that the problem might be, like technological, or it might be institutional. Actually, like often it's just a block in the people's heads, and we get back to the death of the symbol, which I think is so important for the civilization resilience. Realizing, Michael Foucault had a brilliant idea, like analogy about this, that we have the prison in our minds, right? Like the prisoners, they don't, from the panopticon, from the circular prison, you just need one guard, and people don't escape because they think they're being watched. The Gestapo was very successful for that same reason. They didn't have as many information as people thought they did, but because people snitched on each other because they were afraid of the omnipotence of the Gestapo because they looked scary. And that's what I think like companies are doing now. They give you this idea of, through manipulating the symbols and the narratives, of the power that they have, but they don't. Like they stand on the backs of these people. This sounds almost neo-Marxist, but I don't mean it to. So by just talking to this like one woman and like just like having a discussion with her, she actually said, oh yeah, well, you know what, fuck it, I'm going to start my own company. That's difficult to do at scale, right? Unless you become a motivational speaker, which I have no intention of doing. Yeah. So I think it's that like kind of scale psychotherapy, almost like this, again, awakening sounds weird, enlightenment, I don't know what to call it, but I think that is going to be the resilience, because if you have a few individuals like this that take the action, I think that's the effect of the butterfly wings. That can have a huge effect on their family, and then their friends, and then the network, and then it can escalate into big things. I don't know what those might be, but I think that looking after the individuals is important and helping them out, and that can maybe trigger a bigger change than we can imagine. I don't know.
It's interesting the advice you gave her, because I think most advice on a personal level, the advice that I'd give wouldn't scale to a policy level. And I think sometimes we get caught in the trap, particularly in like political discourse, where you hear, especially on the conservative side of British politics, people espousing policy as if they're advising one single person. But like in many instances, that sort of advice doesn't scale to the level of policy. And so when it's like, I'm a huge advocate of individual responsibility. But when you have an outcome that's like, when you have a negative outcome at the scale of millions of people, that's not millions of people just making bad decisions. There's obviously something systemic that's going wrong that requires a policy implementation to rectify it. And I just think as society, we're not very good at addressing those differences in terms of the difference between personal advice and policy.
Yes, I completely agree, which is why, I'm very wary, speaking here, and it's just my personal opinion.
I love it. I wasn't scolding you.
I know.
It was a comment on just, it was just a comment.
But by the way, this is really important with archaeology as well, because I think the way that we view our past is then we kind of transplant it on the present and the future as well. So, when we as archaeologists understand the database of humanity, that happened in the past, the things that we do is often generalized. We make big sweeping statements about entire civilizations, and also archaeologically, it's very difficult to pin down individual agency, because how do you extract agency and free will out of the ground, right? You can get it out of writings, but often the writings are heavily manipulated. It's also there's a huge data bias. So one of the reasons why we revere Plato so much and love him so much and talk about the Republic, etc., is because he wrote a lot of shit, and most of it survived. Diogenes used to live naked with a hen masturbating in a barrel and didn't really write all that much at all, and that's why I think he's also not in the history books, because he's a difficult character to kind of wrap your head around.
I only found out about him recently, and I just think, what a Chad of a guy.
Oh, he's brilliant. Diogenes was the ultimate lad. I loved that. If we all could live like Diogenes, just in a barrel chilling out, that'd be great.
Did not give a fuck. He really did not. And what a brain on the guy too,
Exactly. But that's the problem, right? Because if we view the past as Julius Caesar and Plato, then you've got a massive problem, because you're not seeing I don't know if you watch, I love this series, Peep Show.
Bits and pieces, yeah.
Okay, Peep Show is brilliant, and there's Mark Corrigan is
You're
my
so
spirit.
British, I swear to God, you are so British. Okay.
Blackadder, all of that,
If I didn't know, I approached you through here and, you lived in Czech Republic, I'd be like, she's British. It's
I'm cosplaying a Brit, it's true. And Mark Corrigan, who's my spirit animal, he tries to go out with this girl, and they go to these past life regressions, when people say who they were in past life. And he says, people always pretend they're Napoleon or Cleopatra's, we're the German toilet cleaners, we're the Chinese peasants. But it's true, because a Chinese peasant doesn't make up for much in a museum. And it's our understanding of the past, and therefore projecting onto the future what leaders should look like, what institutions should look like, are based on a really small data sample, really small bias. And so therefore, no wonder people who learn and probably hate history at school, no wonder they think that they have no power in a society, because they haven't heard stories of people like that in past making a difference. So they think, why should I make a difference? I have to be in politics to make a difference. No, please don't go into politics and try and make a difference. It's a machine. It's a ruse. So I think that even one person from, say, a poor family, poor background, can make a huge change. When it comes to not looking after people and systemic failure, again, it's tricky, and I think it has to come from the bottom up, because anything that comes top down is just going to be based on statistics, and there's going to be people that benefit massively and people who fall off the cliff.
As Bitcoiners, we're only too well aware of that, with the Cantillon effect. I'm not sure, are you familiar with the Cantillon effect? No. It's basically people who are the closest to the money printer, the Federal Reserve, the banks. They get first access to the debased currency, which is printing of new funds, and they get to buy things, assets in particular, at the current prices. And by the time that money permeates through society and inflation then boosts asset prices, so by the time you get it as just a regular working Joe, everything's already more expensive because of the presence of that money. So the people who get the money first benefit the most.
Yeah. Well, it's also interesting, like the way, we're talking about trade and value at the beginning, and there was a really interesting, it was a libertarian experiment, I think in the beginning of the 19th century, called the Cincinnati Time Bank, where you had these time dollars that were exchanged, and like they try to quantify time basically and assign value to that. But there's something to be said for that when we mention like the gift giving at the beginning and like social capital, cultural capital, things like that actually have huge effect in society and often lead to it's like if you're a good person, you're respected by the community, you might get, rent somewhere for free, right? Which is actually translated to money, quite a big bargain that you're getting. And I wonder like whether the kind of competition to traditional financial tokens like that either come from like educational capital, social capital, etc. When we start tokenizing these things and basically like diversify what it means to have value in different types of tokens, that is really interesting to me, which is why, again, like Bitcoin is so interesting to me anthropologically, because you're suddenly saying there's another way in which you can get money than the traditional way. And I think that, Bitcoin and like crypto in general was the first time when geeks basically suddenly transferred their kind of like brain power and brain capital and social capital into actual financial capital very, very quickly. And you had like suddenly this new spike of this new elite that was unimaginable, 10 years ago. And I think that's going to be the effect of these technologies that, for example, I'm trying to program this cultural passport thing. I love museums, right? So I'm trying to find this way of like how you can get stamps across different museums and compare the knowledge that you get. And it's a work in progress, but think of like the scouting movement, but just for museums and galleries, and for adults as well. So I'm trying to play around with it, and with the help of AI, I was able to like build a website, be able to build a wireframe, trying to like test out various things, like upload like some database.
What are you using?
Oh, like UX pilot, lovable, like a very like patchwork, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire, like a patchwork empire of tools. And probably like from a cybersecurity perspective, it's probably shit, but it helps me to visualize it and move like pretty quickly. And we were calculating it with my friend that like the work I did for like, that I paid like a license of $29, it was like 100K's worth that I would be seeking VC investment for like 2 years ago. Yeah. So I think that's going to be massive, that you have people who have kind of bypassed the gatekeepers, and suddenly a measly archaeologist like me can build a website, which is a huge thing for me. So I think that like suddenly you're going to have the monetization of like unexpected groups that like pop up, and people who thought that they were like meaningless and who have no like effect on the direction of society are suddenly going to become like close to a ruling class. Yeah. That's interesting as well.
I think given a lot of the early Bitcoiners still are libertarians. And I think that's probably, of the main ideologies, that's probably the most marginalized. Like they don't really have a representation in either wing of politics, maybe a little bit on the conservative side. But I think they're going to be a little bit more influential as a cohort, at least in America. And I can already see some of that coming through. I mean, you could argue perhaps parts of Silicon Valley are libertarian, but I don't think they are. I think they're very Silicon Valley. Yes. That's what they are. So it's like
I used to work in. Sorry, this is no particular like
no, it's all right.
point, but when I used to go to LA for my job, the people who I worked with were brilliant. But I mentioned the potlatch of the Native Americans, and this, for an anthropologist, and especially for someone who's quite like dry, black humor, like quite British, like in my like disposition in that sense. When I went there, and a part of like how the company organized itself, it would do like circles. So you like sit in a circle, like Alcoholics Anonymous, and you'd be like, "Hi, my name is Sara, and I'm feeling this today." And everybody like, "Yeah, that's amazing." And it was quite funny because I couldn't take it, and I was like and I'd try to like, because you can't go against the grain entirely because you don't want to be fired, but I just couldn't. And so we formed this like small group of me and a couple of the techies who are like also very much against this kind of thing. And there was this one guy, Jeremy, who's fantastic, and he would just drink bourbon and he just like completely sabotage these circles. It was brilliant. But actually it got to a point where, you know, they tried to like cosplay hunter-gatherers, and basically like transplant the things like onto a startup, and they thought that like recreating like these like ritual scenarios would make them function better as a company. But actually all it created was that like people would spend half their time in work crying and actually getting no work done because they were just like, because it suddenly became very sexy to cry in these circles.
Oh,
like,
I see.
Become very like emotionally charged, because that meant that you had more of a heart than the rest, right?
You were really into it.
You were really into it, exactly. And so it just became like, they had to stop it because it just became like this obscure, like emotional cesspit, and actually like really like starting to waft of like a lot of unresolved trauma. And they were like, no, actually like this is probably like not great and not constructive what we're doing. So it's quite funny, like in Silicon Valley, like when you have, you know, like...
How do they come, sorry to interrupt you, how do they come up with that idea? Who sold them on that?
Well, that's what I mean. It's these like Silicon Valley gurus, right, who go to Burning Man once and like take a bit of LSD.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And then suddenly they're like, hey, you know what we should do? We should be more like the hippies,
feelings,
man. It's like, oh, fuck off. Like,
bring the whole person. Don't bring the whole person. Do your job. How about that?
Yeah.
Crack a joke at the water cooler. Go back to your desk and do your job.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. All right.
And actually, like, speaking of which, you know, like making again like a 360 to the start of our conversation, I love humor, and I love like making jokes, and I like taking the piss. And I think that like the jester phenomenon in society is so important. And this is when we're getting back to like the fact that we're like in an unprecedented time historically, because I think that there was a huge danger with like kind of Web 2 and the dissemination of information, of censorship, and of the censorship of algorithms, and like, you know, what classifies as a joke, what is kind of in dangerous territory. And I love like Ricky Gervais and Monty Python and, you know, Rowan Atkinson, when they talk about the fact that to be able to take the piss out of status quo is like the ultimate way of evolutionary survival. So like for me, like maintaining a sense of humor is like crucial, and Silicon Valley has totally lost that because everyone takes themselves so seriously, and like that, yeah.
Well, I think that was the ultimate failure of the so-called woke movement. You know, that certain faction of the left was the complete inability to take a joke, any kind of joke, and to twist any kind of comment into some kind of weapon in the victimhood Olympics. And you're like, guys, we're just joking. You fuck off over there. We're in a comedy club. Yeah. We know what we're here for. Yeah. You weren't there. We laughed. We understood what we're in for. You can't take a clip that someone recorded and then be offended somewhere else on Twitter, for example. And it's like, we've got to be able to have a laugh about certain things, you know. And it's just like, and sometimes it can be offensive, but it's not funny because it's offensive. It's funny because it's outrageous, and we're laughing at the outrageous comment in and of itself. We're not endorsing the outrageous comment. We're endorsing the outrage. Like, it's like, exactly. I can't believe you just said that. That's what's funny about it. And they just took themselves way too seriously, and it was suffocating, actually. One of the most palpable differences between pre-Elon and post-Elon's acquisition was actually you can just say things. Yeah. And I like that Twitter has offensive people, because I want to know what someone is like. I don't want them to hide it, and I don't want the platform to suppress it either. Yeah, I want to see it. I want to know what the narratives are. I want to know what the thought processes are of all of the different factions of society, even the ones I find really objectionable. I want to see it. I don't want it suppressed. Whereas they literally were curating what was acceptable opinion. They were literally doing that. And it got to the point where the censorship was like to such a fine degree, to such a large extent that they were doing that. It's like, I don't know what you can say anymore.
Yes, yeah. And like the common sense completely goes out of the window. It's the same, like, because I love memes. I'm obsessed by memes. I think genuinely memes are the most resilient thing that humanity has come up with now. Like, I think memes are just brilliant. And, but But anyway, like back in the day, like 2018, 2019, Elon actually replied and liked a few of my memes. So,
there you go.
oh yeah. It's mainly like oscillating about like around like Lord of the Rings and stuff. But I'm exactly the same, right? Because I'm an archaeologist, and I like in 2,000 years time, archaeologists would give an arm and a leg to know what we know about like status quo, right? Because like always you get such a diminished picture of the past. Like if we got a time machine and could go back to the Roman Empire and know what they're thinking, what they're saying, that would be brilliant, because that would give us so much insight. And I think that what we're doing now is like we're live tweeting or like live recording an archaeological record for the future. And that's why I want people to be honest. I want to be able to say I made a mistake. I want to be able to say, when you ask me something I have no idea, to say I've got no idea, rather than pretend I do, because like what point is that in there, And I think that like again, like the difference between this information revolution that is happening is that we have the unique opportunity, I think we should take it, of pretending that we're perfect, that we know everything, and just give it up. Like be human with all our flaws, because they're not necessarily flaws, they're just us being human, and that's fine.
Well, we see that there's a particular journalist that I've come to like recently, and people are saying, this is what you said 6 years ago about this topic, and it was the complete opposite. And you go, I changed my mind.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
You're not even allowed to change your mind.
Yeah.
You're like, I changed my mind. I thought that because I didn't know this.
Yeah.
Now that I do, I changed my mind.
Yeah.
It's like, isn't that fantastic that you can actually do that? You can. So I feel like people now are at liberty to make mistakes.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And it's okay. Like, if you can speak clearly, freely, and then the next step to that is, I spoke freely, I was wrong.
Yeah.
I've changed my mind. I'm not sure we're there yet, but at least now people can speak much more freely.
Yeah.
And Elon gets a lot of criticism, and I'm sure he brings a lot of that onto himself. But you see on the platform, people are mercilessly criticizing him, mocking him, and he allows that. And I think it's a credit to him and the platform that even to that extent we're allowed to do it. Apparently, some people claim he does take censorious action, but by and large, I'm seeing that we can speak more freely, we can say things, and I can't stress how valuable that is. It just makes it, you just feel like you can breathe, and I think the quality of discourse improves as a result of having all sorts of opinions heard anyway.
Oh, completely. Yeah.
But some people find that objectionable. I don't want offensive comment. You shouldn't be able to say this and stay on the platform. And I could never find that to be a convincing argument. Yeah.
To be honest with you, like so like Instagram comments, right? They have this reputation for being like so much like worse than TikTok, which is all like I don't go on TikTok. It's too much for me. But like I go on Instagram for the comments because they're just merciless. It's brilliant. But like so often I find that you will have like a reel of like someone who's, for example, disabled or something, and like you will have like some like nasty but humorous comments, but if someone is genuinely nasty, like the swarm intelligence is such that people will actually go after them, and it's a very kind of self-policing, like you can't have the algorithm police that. But I do think that maybe I'm naive, but like a lot of people are fundamentally like good human beings. If you see someone like kicking a dog, or if you see someone bullying someone, you take action. Maybe I'm like naive in that, but I think that like if you let people speak freely and if you allow them to show themselves to be the assholes that they are, they will exclude themselves naturally from the community, because being an asshole is, I think, fundamentally evolutionarily not intelligent. Because like unless you're like blackmailing people or coercing them to be on your side, but like people don't want to be in a situation where they feel uncomfortable or where they don't feel great. And I think that the freedom, it'll bring a bit of chaos at the start, but like out of chaos like emerges a natural complexity where I think that these people naturally just like get expunged from the community, which I think is good. Obviously, like not in all cases, but I think policing things is not great. So I'm happy for the freedom of like as much as possible of speech as well.
Well, the free speech aspect is a key part of creating resilience in society, right? Because if you've never encountered an objectionable comment, the first time that you do, your reaction is going to be a very inflamed reaction, right? But if you've understood how to digest those sorts of comments, maybe the first time you get upset, and second or third time they stop getting a rise out of you, right? I just think, yet exposure creates a better response, a better ability to absorb that sort of stuff.
Yeah, completely. And, you know, we go back to, you mentioned universities and things like that. We don't teach that to people, you know, how to deal with criticism, how to give criticism, how not to become tribalized. These are things, I think, again, that come to kind of civilizational resilience that should be a part of like this almost like resilience literacy that people should have, you know, like like, you know, I've been going to therapy for a couple of years. I know it's a very popular thing to do. Everyone thinks that we're snowflakes, but it's a part of me trying to be resilient because I know that like through some kind of alchemy of like my past, I've, you know, tended to maybe overreact on some things or like be anxious or not be able to say no, you know, this the standard stuff that like we see in the world around us. And actually like therapy has really like helped me, and I've now started noticing that, for example, I'm able to ask for money for some things, you know, and I would otherwise do it for free because I'd be grateful for the attention, and now I'm actually able to say, hey, can you give me money for this because I think it deserves it? Or like not even explain myself, or like, you know, no is a complete sentence and stuff like that. And it sounds so like wishy-washy bullshitty, but actually these aspects of like mental resilience are so important, like to create a healthy community, healthy society, healthy relationships. So I think that's definitely a part of it, but you don't really get that taught in schools, you know?
Can I just share something? I don't think you're at all alone when it comes to demanding fair pay for the things that you do. I have friends who are very, very talented. Not coincidentally women, they find it really confronting to ask for what they think they're worth. I think if you ask them what do you think you're worth, they will give you a very clear answer. But when it comes to the process of asking for that, they're very reticent. They don't want that confrontation, even though they're absolutely worth, in some instances, multiples of what they're even asking. I have a friend of mine. They're two friends. They're very talented, and they're very creative. And I'm telling them, listen, if they commissioned what you just did through a creative agency, 50, 100,000, absolutely no problem. And they would not get an outcome, a deliverable, anywhere close to the quality of what you've just delivered. Because you understand the industry, you have a sensibility for this and that. But it's a lot of people have that difficulty, particularly women. I'm sure you've encountered in your discussions with your friends, and for example, I mean, confrontation is not an easy thing for a lot of people to deal with, right? I mean, I'm a very confident guy and I'm not shy from confrontations, but I'd rather avoid sort of that animus, right? I don't want to get into that. And it's one of the things I don't like. I don't like negotiating legal documents. Because lawyers have a particular posture, and that brings out a part in me that I've tried to tame most of my life. And then I find it really hard to engage in that process of negotiating in that sort of temperature, and then going back and saying, hey, we have a lovely agreement, let's have a wonderful working relationship, because I feel like I've just been through hell with you. It's kind of like going out for dinner, like having a boxing match and then going out for dinner with the guy who just tried to kill. And I don't feel very comfortable with that.
And the funny thing is, like, thank you for sharing this, because I think a vast majority of people feel this way. And another thing that, archaeology, I think, has the potential of unlocking from the past and like from the stories the way they were, not the way that they're written in history books, is this idea of the social guilt, or like the cultural guilt. Because, like, just for example, 7 deadly sins, I call them the 7 awesome wins instead, because I think that, people do drugs, people booze, people like sex, people like gossiping, like all these things that are like basically like psychopharmaceuticals, like Dunbar calls it psychopharmaceuticals, where you basically, go for a beer because it relaxes you and you feel good, or like, you have sex because it feels good and it's, it's fine and it's not nothing to be frowned at. And because you needed to, as civilization scaled, you needed to like tame the human temperament. A lot of these like even 19th century, 18th century literature is about becoming like enlightened and almost like ascetic, like away from these like animal tendencies. We're human, we're better than that. bullshit. No, we're not. We're animals. We're hairless apes that is just like bits of meat with electricity in them. That's what we are. And I think that this guilt around, not liking confrontation, therefore like worrying that you'll appear weak, or things like asking for money because it'll appear transactional because of the reciprocity thing we discussed at the beginning, right? All these tendencies have a very kind of Paleolithic baseline. And I think that having a much more honest discussion of a politician saying, I don't know because I'm a human being and I cannot possibly process in my mind within 24 hours all of this COVID data that I got. So I need to ask ChatGPT because it's going to be probably better than if I pretend to understand and then give you a verdict. So why don't we just ask ChatGPT together? Like having this like de-bullshitting society, I think would lead to so much more healthy, resilient civilizations. So yeah.
I wonder. I have a friend of mine. She started recently a paid group where she gives advice in a particular domain. She priced her paid group at a premium. And that acted as an incredible quality filter for the types of people who joined her paid group. And as a result, she enjoys the interactions more. She pours her heart and soul into it to give them everything because she knows, first of all, the type of person who's paying to be there really values her and they really put the effort into learning and understanding what she's talking about. And so that in turn rewards her. It makes her feel like it's fulfilling work. And so rather than like looking at a fee to appear somewhere or do some work as something you're asking for, is more as a filter to see how much they actually value that. Are they the sort of person that I want to work with? Do they value it enough? Rather than can you pay me for this? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
And people use that in e-commerce, for example. Instead of doing free sign-ups and trials, they say, it's 30 days, it's only $1. Because what a lot of businesses find is that the disposition to sign up for that $1 makes them much more likely to sign up for another plan. So you tend to focus your marketing efforts, your relationship and customer service efforts as well. And I guess it's the same with you. It's like, you've got limited time. You can't do everything for everybody. And so like, well, okay, what is a fair amount that will make you affordable enough for the people you still wish to serve who don't necessarily have a lot of money, but still worth your time? Yeah,
and this is really interesting. Is like the whole like putting your money where your mouth is, and like that money is almost like a stake of, yes, I'm taking this seriously. And I'm wondering whether there's other forms of capital that can be kind of and I genuinely think like Bitcoin opened up this discussion hugely. Is suddenly like it's not $1 or £1, like it's a digital token, that is mathematically much more secure and makes much more sense than $1. But it's fundamentally like a new way of like staking trust and value. And like this is something that really interests me, like putting money where your mouth is. If you put time where your mouth is, or put like emotion where your mouth is. The problem is that those things are not yet valued in society in a way that can get you the short-term things like needing to pay rent. But like what really interests me is like philosophies, for example, around things like learn to earn, where like, for example, you learn something and like you get back a token that immediately like you can exchange on a marketplace for a value. So basically you get to this situation where, I was talking to people about this and they're like, oh, but where's the production for the economy in that? Where's the real value? And I was saying, in the 9th century, when you had the Muslim conquest of Spain, for example, they would dedicate huge money and huge resources and time to these like people that were just studying, because they knew that in like 100, 200 years, that's going to come to fruition, not in this generation, but it's going to make the society resilient, like, 6 generations down the line. And I think that this investment into like letting people educate themselves, follow that kind of Homo sapiens, which is, in our name, the curiosity and the thirst for knowledge, that's something that if we could tokenize and value in and of itself would be phenomenal. So the learn to earn aspect really interests me as well in that regard, that because it means that even like poor people or people who don't have the personal characteristics that would make them financially successful, but could make them educationally successful, if that could translate into the same exchange value, then you would have, again, a rise of another elite that has a different personality type, that's maybe a different demographic, but I think that could be a really interesting shake-up for civilizations as well.
Perhaps if I can share, one of the things that I did there are a lot of companies that approach me at various times for brand partnerships and the like, but I don't want to saturate my feed with advertising.
Yeah.
And so what I do is I price at a premium, and then when there are other little projects that I want to support personally, I will just post them free of charge, right? And so that way I filter out most of them. I respect my audience, so I don't saturate them with advertising, and I know that the companies who paid the price truly value the attention and exposure to my audience, and that helps me then support other projects free of charge as well. So it's like, I'm sure that could work with you as well. Like use your fee as a filter, quality filter, and that means when there is something that you go, I really want to do it, I know they don't have the money, but because you've got other people paying you, you're able to do that.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And actually, again, going back to AI, I think like the effects of it are going to be very prosaic, but like for example, for content creation, right? Like I love steampunk and I love like alternate histories. So for example, like the Romans, they had, and the Greeks, like the Hieron of Alexandria, they had like prototypes of steam engines. And there's a whole sci-fi, because the Romans didn't see the steam engine as particularly important to them, so they had it, but they were like, that doesn't matter to us. If they actually developed steam engine for manufacture, like what our world would look like, and it's this whole like steampunk version of Rome, and I like love that. But obviously, like I can't draw for shit. Like I can't, none of that stuff. So actually, AI is hugely like liberating in the sense I can start creating all this content, and I think this is interesting when we go back to like authority and like where the money is concentrating right now. I'm thinking about like Hollywood, which basically like had the domain for storytelling, and like if a Hollywood says a story, like that story is going to fly around the world, it's going to become a meme, like everyone's going to know it. And you have the knock-on effect of Hollywood of like things like the Met Gala and like all these like obscure celebrities being paid like ludicrous amounts of money. And AI is going to topple that power dynamic because you're going to be able to make a feature film from your...
It's happening already. I've discovered numerous Instagram accounts, and there's obviously someone behind it who's got the power of narrative.
Gossip Goblin, he's fantastic, yeah.
Oh, is that one? I found another. I'm trying to remember the name. I can't. But this guy is using AI to make kind of like movie trailers and also like meme formats. He's taken like current affairs and then putting it into a meme format of commentary and analysis, and he's just doing such a fantastic job. And I think within the next year there'll be some kind of a hit.
Yeah.
Right, hit show that's purely AI generated.
Yes.
Especially with the latest iteration of AI video generation. I think it's called VO3. VO3 is, I think it's from Google. Incredibly impressive.
Yeah, and you got Suno and like all these, and it's nuts. It is so good, and it's just going to get, as you say, like exponentially better. And I'm actually really interested in AI for gaming because so this is actually quite funny. It's cool because again, us as archaeologists, we can't really program much, or like most of us, right? But what used to take ages, for example, creating a 3D model of a castle or something like that, like a replica, like a digital twin. Suddenly, like you can do that actually like relatively easily, and we're talking about this with definitely like take a look at them. They're fantastic in how they innovate. They're a cultural institution, the House of Lobkowitz, and they had everything taken first by the Nazis and then by the communists, and they came back as basically like refugees. They got some of their stuff back from the Czech state, but they were like, okay, now what? We've got 4.5 kilometers of archives. We don't have the money. Like we've got these like crumbling chateaus that the communists used to store fertilizer in. Like what do we do with this? And so we did this using drones and like this laser backpack. We did this 3D model of one of their castles up in North Czech Republic. It was the first time that a 3D model was created. And we're thinking about what to do with it because we're like, great, we've got a digital twin, now what? And actually, one of the things that we're thinking of doing, it's not like specifically on the cards, but we're kind of blue sky thinking, is put it into a game like Assassin's Creed. Because like when, for example, Notre Dame burned down in Paris, they actually went to the Assassin's Creed team because they had such an exact virtual replica of Notre Dame that's what they reconstructed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's nuts.
That's incredible.
And video games, I love video games because it gives humanity, like humanity is bad at creating like simulators, what if we take this decision, right? So like you had philosophers for this traditionally, that they would think, oh, if we do this, what's going to happen? But usually like if you take a decision like invade a country or press the red button, that's an irreversible thing that happens. But video games give this like human sandbox of testing out like, takeover and conflict, etc., in a safe space where nothing can really happen to you, which is why I think they're so addictive and so great. So actually, this is the wonderful thing about interdisciplinarity. You can take archaeology, you can give us AI tools so that we can take the physical finds that we have into the digital realm. And then from an archaeologist, you can become a game developer where you can create something immersive, like Plato's Republic. It's one of the research projects that we have. We want to create like this VR simulation where basically you put on the VR goggles, you in ancient Greece, in Plato's polis, and you get the philosopher king come to you and say, hey, you need to increase your yield and give us more taxes. And suddenly that decision making is on you, and you think, okay, am I actually going to give him more of my hard-earned crops, or am I going to whack him over the head with something and take over, or I'm going to fuck off and start my own polis? What am I going to do? And suddenly I think that technology gives people the ability to simulate the what ifs a lot more realistically, which again we didn't have with the previous information revolutions. And I think that suddenly even someone sitting in their small flat who don't think that they don't dare to dream because they're so bogged down with things like paying rent, suddenly they can try living these alternate lifestyles, and they can start experimenting with their confidence as well through whether that's video games or VR or these immersive experiences. And I think that can have a huge effect on the population, because suddenly even the poorest can have access to technology that gives them some tangibility to their dreams and passions and thoughts. And I think that's a hugely powerful mechanic for civilizational resilience again. Yeah. Sorry, I made a bit of a 360 from
that was great.
From archaeology to game development, but
ADHD
yeah.
Definitely detected, but it's fantastic. No, I enjoy expansive conversations. Sara Polak, thank you very much for joining us. We've actually been going for 2.5 hours.
Oh God,
yeah.
I'm so sorry, guys.
Yeah.
That's ADHD for you, but thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for coming and joining us. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care. Bye.